Millbrook, Pennsylvania sat in the kind of autumn that made men forget why they ever left small towns. The maples blazed orange on and red along Main Street, and the air carried that particular crispness that promised winter without threatening it yet. September mornings like this one, the town woke slowly, steam rising from coffee cups and kitchen windows, school buses rumbling down residential streets where kids still walked to stops without parents hovering. Jackson Cole woke at 0500 hours. He'd been doing it for 45 years, ever since a drill sergeant at Paris Island had screamed him awake on his first morning as a Marine recruit. The habit had followed him through 2 tours in Vietnam, through 30 years running a motorcycle shop, through a marriage that ended, and a daughter who moved to California and called twice a year. His body didn't need an alarm anymore. Some part of his brain still believed that sleeping past dawn could get him killed. The bedroom of his apartment above the shop held almost nothing. A mattress on a metal frame, a dresser with 3 drawers, 2 of them empty, a photograph on the nightstand showing a young woman with dark hair and his eyes laughing at something outside the frame. His sister Kimberly, aged 16, 3 years before everything went wrong. Hawk, everyone called him Hawk, had for decades made his bed with hospital corners, the blanket pulled tight enough to bounce a quarter. Another habit from the Corps. He dressed in jeans and a black t-shirt, pulled on boots that had seen 1,000 miles of highway. The leather vest came last, worn soft as skin, the patches on the back telling a story to anyone who knew how to read them. Not an outlaw club, never that. Just men who'd served, who'd come home, who'd found they still needed a unit. The coffee maker in his kitchen was the most expensive thing he owned. Good coffee mattered when you woke this early. He stood at the window while it brewed, watching Main Street come to life below. The streetlights clicked off automatically at 0530. Tom Hendricks opened his hardware store at 0600, the only man in town who kept earlier hours than Hawk. The breakfast crowd would start hitting Miller's Diner around 0630. Hawk poured his coffee black hot enough to burn. He'd learned to drink it, scalding in the jungle where lukewarm meant the enemy was close enough that you couldn't risk the smoke from heating it. Some lessons stayed carved into your bones. His Harley started on the first kick. The rumble echoed off the brick buildings, a sound that made dogs bark and babies cry, and old veterans lift their heads with something like recognition. The ride to Miller's took 4 minutes. He could have walked it in 10, but the bike mattered, not for show, because sometimes you needed to be able to leave fast and feet wouldn't cut it. Miller's Diner had occupied the corner of Main and Fletcher since 1964, back when Hawk was still young enough to think wars were won by the people who fought them. Red vinyl booths, chrome-edged tables, a checkerboard floor that had been mopped so many times the pattern was fading in the high-traffic areas. Linda Martinez had owned the place for 15 years, ever since her husband died and left her with a mortgage and a choice between selling and surviving. She'd been a Navy nurse in Desert Storm. That's why Hawk ate there every Tuesday morning and had for 5 years. Some bonds didn't require explanation. His booth was in the back corner, natural tactical position. Back to the wall-clear view of both entrance and kitchen door, close enough to the emergency exit to matter. 3 other men sat there already nursing coffee, not talking. They didn't need to. They'd ridden together long enough that silence was its own language. Marcus Reed, 39, still had the posture of the Army Ranger. He'd been before an IED in Fallujah sent him home with a Purple Heart and nightmares that woke his wife 3 times a week. He'd moved to Millbrook for the quiet, found Hawk's shop, found purpose in the work of rebuilding motorcycles and the company of men who didn't ask questions about the scars. Thomas Wilson Bear, to everyone, took up a booth and a half by himself. 52 years old, built like his nickname, with hands that could crush beer cans or splint a child's broken finger with equal facility. He'd been a volunteer EMT for 20 years after his stint in the military ended. Saved 14 lives that anyone could count. Lost his daughter to an overdose 5 years back after her boyfriend got her hooked. After that boyfriend had done other things Bear found out about too late. Vincent Carter went by Jack, short for Jackson, which made 2 Jacksons in the same crew, but nobody minded. 44 military police background, Gulf War veteran, who'd seen what happened when people forgot that rules existed for reasons. He kept a notebook in his vest pocket, wrote down details other men missed. Dates times license plates. The world made more sense when you documented it. Linda brought coffee without asking. She'd served them so many times she knew the pour by heart. Hawk and Marcus Black Bear with 2 sugars, Jacks with cream. She'd also served in a war zone, knew what it meant when men gathered before dawn without speaking. The television above the counter showed morning news nobody watched. Outside the window, Millbrook woke up on schedule. School buses appeared at predetermined stops. Mothers waved from doorways. Everything normal, everything safe, everything the way small Pennsylvania towns had always been. Hawk sipped his coffee and watched the street with eyes that had spent 2 years scanning jungle tree lines for movement that didn't belong. Old skills didn't fade. They just found new targets. 3 weeks ago, on a Tuesday morning, almost identical to this one, he'd noticed her for the first time. The woman Sarah Morrison had started working at Miller's in late August, picking up shifts when Linda needed coverage. Single mother, mid-30s, the kind of tired that came from working 2 jobs and raising a kid alone. She'd brought her daughter in once before the morning shift started so the girl could eat breakfast before school. Emma, 8 years old, small for her age, with dark hair pulled back in a ponytail that had been brushed, but not carefully. She'd sat across from her mother in a booth by the window, picking at pancakes, not eating them. Hawk had noticed because he'd spent 6 months after Vietnam working at a VA hospital, volunteering with kids whose fathers came home different. He knew what trauma looked like in small bodies. The way Emma had sat, back straight, shoulders tense, checking the door every time someone walked in. Hypervigilant. That's what the doctors called it. When your nervous system couldn't relax because it had learned that threats came from everywhere. The way she'd flinched when a man walked past her booth. Just a customer, old man in his 70s, harmless as sunrise. But Emma's whole body had gone rigid for a second before forcing itself still again. The way she'd kept her hands in her lap except when actively using fork or knife. Protective posture. Hiding something or protecting something or just making herself smaller. Hawk had filed it away as interesting but not actionable. Kids went through phases. Maybe she'd seen something scary on television. Maybe she'd had a nightmare. Maybe she was just shy. Then he'd seen her again the following week. Same booth, same untouched pancakes, same tension in her small shoulders. But this time bruises on her wrist. Old ones fading to yellow-green, the kind that came from being grabbed hard enough to leave marks. Sarah hadn't seemed to notice. She'd been rushing through breakfast, checking her phone, clearly stressed about something. Work probably, money probably. The same pressures that made single mothers miss things they should have seen. When they'd left, a man had been waiting in a blue pickup truck across the street. Emma had walked to that truck like a prisoner walking to execution. Slow steps, head down, shoulders hunched. The man had leaned over to open the passenger door. Emma had climbed in. The truck had driven away. Hawk had asked Linda about it, casual, just curious. Linda had explained Sarah's new husband, Kyle Morrison. They'd been married about a year, seemed nice enough, worked construction, made decent money, helped Sarah out financially, which she needed. Emma's father had disappeared when the kid was 2. No child support, no contact. Kyle took Emma to school most mornings when Sarah worked the early shift, picked her up most afternoons, involved stepfather, modern family, everything normal, except Emma's eyes. Those eyes held something Hawk had seen before in a mirror 30 years ago, when his sister Kimberly had still been alive. The 3rd week, Emma had started locking herself in the diner's bathroom. Linda had mentioned it to Hawk, worried. The kid would ask to use the restroom, then stay in there for 10 minutes, 15. Linda had knocked once, concerned. Emma had opened the door, immediately apologized, gone back to her booth. But her hands had been shaking. Locking doors, creating barriers, establishing safe spaces in public places where attackers couldn't follow. That's when Hawk had known. Not suspected. Known. With the certainty that came from having ignored the same signs once before and paid for it with his sister's life. He'd called a meeting at the VFW hall for that Friday evening. Post 312 established 1946 home to 73 veterans ranging from Korean War to Afghanistan. The building smelled like old coffee and older memories, with photographs covering every wall. Men who'd served, men who'd died, men who'd come home and tried to figure out what home meant when the war stayed lodged behind your eyes. 20 men had shown up, the usual crowd for non-mandatory meetings. Colonel Frank Morrison had presided from his usual chair at the head of the table, 81 years old Korean War veteran who'd commanded a company at Chosin Reservoir. He'd been leading this post for 36 years through every conflict America had stumbled into. His authority came from age and experience and the kind of respect that couldn't be awarded by any military board. Hawk had presented the situation clinically. 8-year-old girl behavioral changes consistent with trauma, physical signs of abuse, pattern of avoidance behaviors. He hadn't mentioned his sister. Didn't need to. Most of the men in that room had their own ghosts. The questions had come quick. How sure was he? What evidence existed? Had anyone reported it? What were they supposed to do about a suspicion? Deputy Ray Torres had been there, Gulf War veteran, who traded his Army uniform for a Sheriff's Department badge 20 years back. He'd explained the legal position carefully. Suspicions weren't enough for intervention. Mandatory reporting laws required specific evidence or disclosure from the child. Without that, they couldn't force an investigation. CPS was overworked and understaffed. They didn't have resources to chase maybes. Then Torres had added something that changed the temperature in the room. He'd run Kyle Morrison's name through the system, just curious. 2 DUI arrests, both dismissed after expensive lawyers got involved. 1 domestic disturbance call from a previous relationship, no charges filed. 3 complaints filed with local Little League about inappropriate physical contact with girls on the team he'd been coaching. Morrison had resigned before any formal investigation began. Pattern. Not proof, but pattern. The kind that made the hairs stand up on the back of necks that had survived combat by paying attention to patterns. Tom Hendricks had spoken up. Vietnam veteran ran the hardware store Quiet Man, who'd seen things in the Mekong Delta that he'd never discussed and never forgotten. He'd known Kyle Morrison's mother, Barbara. Respected woman, worked at the library, volunteered everywhere. If there were concerns, maybe someone should talk to her first. Colonel Morrison had called for a vote on establishing what he termed protective observation protocol. Not intervention, not confrontation, just awareness. Veterans in the community would keep eyes open. If Emma needed help, she'd have people ready to provide it. If the concerns proved unfounded, no harm done. The vote had been unanimous. 20 men raising their hands in a VFW hall on a Friday night, pledging to protect a child they didn't know. Because that's what warriors did when they stopped fighting foreign enemies and started protecting home ground. Hawk had taken operational command, military habits dying hard. He'd established observation rotations. Marcus would position himself near the elementary school during drop-off hours. Bear would volunteer more often at the community center, where Emma's after-school program met. Jax would document everything in his notebook, building a case file in case it was ever needed. Tom would have quiet conversations with other business owners on Main Street, establishing a network of eyes. Torres had promised to review every report filed about Kyle Morrison, looking for anything that might provide legal grounds for a wellness check. He'd also mentioned he'd approach Barbara Morrison, privately feel out whether she had concerns about her son. They'd adjourn the meeting with the understanding that this might amount to nothing. Might be paranoia from old soldiers seeing threats everywhere. But if they were right, if Emma needed help, she'd have an entire platoon ready to respond. That had been 4 days ago. Friday night at the VFW, and now Tuesday morning back at Miller's Diner, Hawk sipping coffee at 0547 hours while the breakfast crowd started to filter in. Emma should have been on the 0745 school bus. Hawk knew the schedule. He'd watched it for 3 weeks, documenting patterns the way Jax had taught him. Sarah's shift had started at 0600. Kyle drove Emma to the bus stop at 0742, waited until she boarded, then drove to whatever construction site he was working that week. Except this morning at 0752, Emma hadn't gotten on the bus. Hawk had watched through the diner window as the yellow vehicle pulled away from the stop on Fletcher Street. No small girl with a backpack climbing aboard. At 0758, Emma had appeared on the sidewalk outside Miller's Diner. No backpack visible, bare arms despite the September morning chill. Walking slowly the way people walked when they'd made a decision they couldn't take back and were terrified of the consequences. She'd stopped 15 feet from the diner entrance, just stood there on the sidewalk, trembling in the morning sun like a bird that had finally found the courage to leave a burning tree but didn't know how to fly. Hawk had set down his coffee cup. Marcus had looked up at the same instant. Some communications didn't require words. Combat veterans developed a sixth sense for when situations changed from normal to critical. The air pressure felt different. Time slowed down. Bear and Jax had both straightened in their seats, following Hawk's line of sight through the window. Linda had noticed too. She'd moved to the door, concern etching lines around her eyes. Hawk had stood slowly, walked to the door with deliberate calm. pushed through it into morning air that tasted like coffee and car exhaust and the particular sharpness that came before everything changed. Emma had seen him emerge. Her whole body had tense flight response, kicking in muscles preparing to run. Hawk had stopped 5 feet away, close enough to talk, far enough to not be threatening. He'd knelt down slowly, bringing himself to her eye level, making himself smaller the way his sister had once told him, made her feel safer when the world got too big and too scary. The morning sounds of Millbrook surrounded them. Traffic on Main Street, a dog barking somewhere, a lawnmower starting up despite the early hour. Normal sounds, everyday sounds, the soundtrack of a town where nothing ever happened except harvests and holidays and high school football games. Emma's eyes had met his for just a second, brown eyes that held too much knowledge for 8 years old. Hawk had spent 2 tours in Vietnam. He'd seen children forced to grow up too fast to learn things no child should know. He recognized that particular kind of theft. His voice came out soft, almost a whisper, the tone he'd used in field hospitals when talking to wounded soldiers who needed to know they were safe before they could let themselves feel the pain. "Morning, miss. You okay?" Emma hadn't answered. Her hands gripped the straps of a backpack that wasn't their phantom motion from muscle memory. "Name's Jackson. Friends call me Hawk. You're Emma, right? I've seen you here with your mom." A tiny nod. Confirmation without commitment. "You miss your bus." Her voice came out so quiet Hawk barely heard it over a passing car. "I didn't want to go." School can be tough sometimes. Something happened. The tears started then. Silent tears that ran down her face without any crying. Sounds the kind of weeping that happened when you'd learned that making noise brought attention you didn't want. Hawk stayed kneeling on the sidewalk, concrete hard against his knees, morning sun warming his back. He'd waited in rice paddies for 3 days without moving when the mission required it. He could wait as long as this child needed to find her voice. "Emma, has someone hurt you? You can tell me. I promise I'll believe you." The words came out in a rush, 3 words compressed into one breath like she had to say them fast before courage failed. "He touched me." Time stopped. The sounds of Main Street faded into background noise. Hawk's heartbeat slowed the way it always did when the training took over and emotion became secondary to mission parameters. His voice stayed gentle, carefully controlled. "Who, sweetheart? Who touched you?" "My stepdad, Kyle. Last night he came in my room again." Again. That single word carried the weight of systematic abuse, of pattern, of a threat that wasn't single incident, but ongoing operation. Again, this has happened before. The sobbing started now, small shoulders shaking, 8 years of trying to be brave, finally cracking under the pressure of being believed for the first time. "I tried to tell Mommy. She said I had bad dreams. But they're not dreams. It's real. It's real and nobody believes me, and I can't make it stop." Hawk's jaw clenched hard enough to make his teeth ache. His hands wanted to form fists. His body wanted to stand up, walk across the street to that blue pickup truck he could see idled 50 feet away, and deliver the kind of justice that military tribunals had once authorized. But that wasn't the mission. The mission was protecting this child, and protecting her meant doing it right, by the book, by the law. So the predator couldn't slip away on technicalities and find victim number 2. "I believe you, Emma, every word." He'd lifted his left hand slowly, 2 fingers extended, in a gesture that probably meant nothing to an 8-year-old girl, but everything to 3 military veterans watching through a diner window. Inside, Marcus had set down his coffee cup. Bear had slid out of his booth. Jax had pulled out his cell phone. No discussion necessary. The code had been established at the VFW meeting. Code Red meant child in immediate danger. All available units respond lethal force, not authorized, but protective force approved as necessary. Marcus had emerged first, moving with the tactical precision of a man who'd cleared houses in Fallujah, where every doorway might hide an insurgent. He'd assessed the situation in one sweep, Emma on sidewalk with Hawk blue pickup truck 50 feet away, with engine running, driver visible behind wheel. Exit route east on Main Street currently clear. Subject appeared to be watching, but not yet attempting to leave. Marcus had walked to his Harley parked strategically at the curb with a clear line to block Main Street and positioned himself to prevent any vehicle from leaving the scene without going through him first. Bear had followed his massive frame filling the diner doorway before he'd stepped onto the sidewalk. He'd moved directly to Emma, positioning his body between the child and the pickup truck. Human shield. Most basic tactical formation in any military manual. You put the largest, most durable asset between the threat and the target. Jax had been on his phone already, voice low and quick. Deputy Torres, Fletcher and Maine, code red situation. 8-year-old female reports sexual abuse by stepfather Kyle Morrison. Subject currently on scene in blue pickup appears to be observing. Request immediate response. Officers Cole Reed Wilson present and securing the scene. He'd hung up without waiting for confirmation. Torres would respond. The question was how fast. Kyle Morrison's truck door had opened. The man himself had started to climb out, 42-years-old construction worker, both face showing that particular expression of entitled anger that came when men who'd gotten away with things for years suddenly faced consequences. Marcus had spoken without raising his voice, each word carrying the kind of quiet authority that came from having ordered men under fire. "Stay in the vehicle, sir." Kyle's voice had carried across 50 feet of morning air. "That's my daughter. Get out of my way." "Stepdaughter, and she's scared, so you're going to sit tight until the authorities arrive." People had started to notice. Morning regulars coming out of the bakery 3 doors down. Mothers dropping kids at bus stops, looking over curiously. Tom Hendricks stepping out of his hardware store, taking in the scene, reading it correctly, moving to position himself where he could provide backup if needed. Cell phones had appeared, people recording, which was exactly what Hawk wanted. Documentation, witnesses, evidence that would hold up in any court. Sarah Morrison had burst through the diner's screen door like a mother bear who just realized her cub was in danger. She'd been wiping down tables, hadn't seen Emma arrive, hadn't known her daughter wasn't on the school bus until Linda had grabbed her arm and pointed outside. Her voice had carried panic and confusion in equal measure. "Emma, baby, what are you doing here? You're supposed to be at school." Emma had torn away from Hawk, running to her mother with the desperate speed of someone who'd been holding it together as long as she could and had finally found a place to fall apart. Sarah had caught her daughter, gone down to her knees on the sidewalk, wrapped arms around a small body that collapsed into sobs. The kind of crying that came from deep places, from wounds that had been hidden too long, from pain that had finally found witness. Emma's words had come out broken by hiccups and tears, but loud enough for everyone within 20 feet to hear. "Mommy, I told them. I finally told someone who believes me." Sarah's face had cycled through confusion, denial, dawning horror, every mother's worst nightmare spelled out in real time. "Told them what, baby? What are you talking about?" "About Kyle, what he does at night, when you're working, what he does to me." The color had drained from Sarah's face. Her hands had started shaking. Whatever she'd been about to say had died in her throat as pieces clicked together. Barbara's warning 3 months ago, Emma's locked door, the nightmares, Kyle's reassurances that he was just checking on her, the way Emma had stopped wanting to be alone with him. All the signs that had been there, invisible until this moment when they became impossible to unsee. Sarah had looked up at Hawk, at the 4 leather-clad men who'd formed a protective perimeter around her daughter. Questions in her eyes. Who were these people? Why were they here? How had they known? Then Emma had said something that made everything else irrelevant. "He hurt me, Mommy. He hurt me, and I tried to tell you, but you didn't believe me." "You believed him." The truth of that statement had hit Sarah Morrison like physical force. She'd bent over her daughter, face crumpling, years of working double shifts and trying to make ends meet, and thinking she'd finally found stability with a man who seemed solid, all of it revealed as the most catastrophic mistake of her life. Kyle's voice had cut across the growing crowd. "Sarah, honey, listen to me. She's confused. You know how she is. Vivid imagination. Remember when she said there was a monster in her closet?" Sarah hadn't looked at him. She'd pulled Emma tighter, her own body shaking now. She was 4 then. She's 8 now. Kids this age, they get ideas from TV, from the internet. Maybe she saw something on that tablet you gave her. Sarah's voice had come out flat, emotionless, in the way that preceded complete breakdown. "Stop. Just stop talking." Marcus had moved slightly, adjusting his position to ensure Kyle couldn't leave the truck without going through him. Jax had his phone out again, camera recording. Bear had stood like a mountain, immovable between Emma and any possible threat. The crowd had grown to maybe 15 people. Mrs. Eleanor Chen from the flower shop next door. Two teachers from the elementary school who'd been getting coffee before classes started. A handful of early morning shoppers. Small-town crowds had a particular way of gathering when something happened pulled by invisible threads of community connection. Deputy Torres' cruiser had turned onto Main Street, lights flashing, but no siren. Torres understood that sirens would have panicked. Emma made the situation worse. He'd pulled to the curb, emerged from his vehicle with the controlled calm of a man who'd spent 20 years responding to calls and had learned that rushing made things worse. He'd taken in the scene with military efficiency. 4 veterans in protective formation around a woman and child. Suspect in vehicle 50 feet away. Multiple witnesses with cell phones out. Everything documented, everything visible, everything by the book. Torres had approached Emma first, kneeling beside her and Sarah the way Hawk had done earlier, bringing himself down to child eye level. His voice had carried the gentle authority of a man who'd interviewed dozens of abuse victims and understood how fragile these moments were. Emma, my name is Deputy Torres. I need to ask you some questions, okay? I need you to tell me what happened in your own words. Emma had looked at her mother. Sarah had nodded, still holding her daughter but giving permission. The story had come out in fits and starts, hesitations and tears and backtracking and clarification. Torres had recorded it on his body camera, asking careful, non-leading questions, giving Emma time to find words for things 8-year-olds shouldn't need vocabulary for. When it started, where it happened, how many times, what Kyle had said, what Emma had said, how she'd tried to tell her mother, how she'd finally decided that morning she couldn't get on the school bus, couldn't go through another day pretending everything was normal. Kyle's voice had risen from his truck, trying again. This is ridiculous. Sarah, you can't believe this. Those bikers, they've been watching us. They probably told her what to say. This is harassment. I'm calling my lawyer. Hawk had finally spoken, his voice carrying the flat authority of a command sergeant who'd given orders in combat and expected them to be followed. You can call your lawyer from the station. Right now, you're going to sit quiet while the deputy does his job. Torres had finished Emma's interview, collected Sarah's corroborating statement, gotten witness statements from Mrs. Chen and Linda Martinez and Tom Hendricks. Then he'd walked to Kyle's truck, hand resting casually on his service weapon in its holster. Kyle Morrison, I need you to step out of the vehicle. I haven't done anything wrong. This is a misunderstanding. Step out of the vehicle, please. Kyle had complied slowly, hands visible, movements careful. He'd been coached by lawyers before, knew how to avoid giving police reasons to escalate. But his face had shown growing panic as he'd realized this wasn't going away with smooth talk and victim blaming. Torres had turned him around, placed hands on the truck hood, begun the practiced routine of a search and custody procedure. His voice had shifted to formal legal register, the words memorized from 1,000 arrests. Kyle Morrison, you are under arrest for suspected sexual abuse of a minor. You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law. You have the right to an attorney. If you cannot afford an attorney, one will be provided for you. The metallic click of handcuffs closing had been the loudest sound on Main Street. Everything else had seemed to fade into background noise. The world had narrowed to that sound, to the sight of Kyle Morrison being placed in the back of a patrol car, to Emma crying in her mother's arms. But something else had happened in that moment, something Hawk hadn't anticipated. Barbara Morrison had appeared in the crowd. Kyle's mother, 64 years old, gray hair, pulled back, face lined, with the kind of weariness that came from carrying impossible knowledge for too long. She'd pushed through the gathered witnesses, moving with deliberate purpose towards Sarah and Emma. People had started to murmur. Everyone knew Barbara, library volunteer, casserole baker, the kind of grandmother figure who organized bake sales and collected coats for winter clothing drives. Everyone assumed she'd come to defend her son, to claim misunderstanding, to rally around family. Barbara had stopped 5 feet from Sarah. Her voice had carried clearly in the morning air, addressing not just Sarah but the entire crowd of witnesses. I warned you 3 months ago. Sarah had looked up, confused, shattered. Barbara, I told you to watch him around Emma. I told you I'd seen patterns in him since he was young. Things that scared me even then. The crowd had gone completely silent. Cell phone cameras had swiveled to capture this moment. Barbara had turned to face the patrol car where her son sat handcuffed in the back seat. When she'd spoken again, her voice had grown louder, stronger, carrying the weight of years of guilt and denial finally breaking open. When Kyle was 16, a girl at church accused him of inappropriate touching. We moved to a different town. I told myself she was lying, that boys his age made mistakes, that it was just misunderstanding. When his first wife left him, suddenly after 6 months, I didn't ask why. When his second girlfriend's daughter ran away from home, I made excuses. I have been making excuses for my son for 28 years. She looked at Emma, then her eyes wet with tears that decades of regret couldn't fully release. I gave you life, Kyle. I raised you. I did everything I could to help you. But I will not stand between you and the consequences of your actions anymore. I will not let another child suffer because I chose to protect my son over protecting the innocent. Barbara had turned back to Sarah, her voice dropping to something more private, though still audible to those standing close. I choose her. I choose Emma. I choose the truth, and I will testify against him if that's what justice requires. The words had hung in the morning air like a verdict delivered by a judge who'd spent years delaying the inevitable sentence. Kyle's face in the patrol car had crumpled. Whatever defenses he'd been constructing, demolished by the one person he'd counted on to maintain his innocence. Torres had put the vehicle in gear lights flashing as he'd pulled away from the curb, taking Kyle Morrison to county lockup where he'd be held pending arraignment. The blue pickup truck had remained at the curb, evidence to be impounded later. The crowd had started to disperse, people returning to their morning routines, but carrying with them the knowledge that Millbrook wasn't the safe small town they'd believed it was. Predators lived everywhere. Sometimes they coached Little League and married your waitress and smiled at church on Sundays. Hawk had approached Sarah and Emma, carefully aware that he was still a stranger, that his leather vest and tattoos might be frightening to a woman whose world had just exploded. Sarah had looked up at him with eyes that held shock and gratitude and 1,000 questions she didn't have energy to ask yet. Linda Martinez had appeared with a blanket, wrapping it around Emma's shoulders, despite the morning not being particularly cold. Combat medics knew that shock required warmth even on warm days. Hawk had gestured toward the diner. Let's get you inside, away from the crowd. We can talk there. Sarah had nodded numbly, rising on legs that didn't seem entirely stable. Emma had clung to her mother's hand like it was the only solid thing in a world that had suddenly revealed itself to be quicksand. Linda had led them to the corner booth, the one farthest from windows, offering privacy in a very public space. She'd brought water for Sarah, hot chocolate with extra marshmallows for Emma, and a plate of fresh cinnamon rolls that appeared without anyone ordering them. Hawk had slid into the booth across from them, Marcus, Bear, and Jax taking positions nearby but not crowding, giving the appearance of casual breakfast while actually maintaining security perimeter. Old skills, new application. Sarah had stared at the water glass without drinking from it, her hands wrapped around it like she needed something to hold on to. When she'd finally spoken, her voice had carried the hollow quality of someone processing trauma in real time. Who are you people? Hawk had chosen his words carefully, aware that everything he said now would determine whether Sarah trusted them or ran from them. My name is Jackson Cole. People call me Hawk. These are my brothers, Marcus, Thomas, Vincent. We're veterans. We run a motorcycle shop. We're part of VFW Post 312, and we pay attention to our town. You've been watching us. We've been watching out for Emma. There's a difference, Bichon. Sarah's eyes had filled with tears that hadn't fallen yet. How long have you known? Suspected for 3 weeks. Knew for certain about 30 seconds after Emma told me. 3 weeks. Sarah had said it like she was testing the weight of the words. You saw it in 3 weeks, and I lived with it for months and didn't see anything. Hawk had leaned forward slightly, his voice gentle but firm. He's good at hiding. Predators usually are. That's how they operate. They find single mothers who are working too hard to notice. They become helpful, trustworthy. They wait until everyone's guard is down. I should have listened to Barbara. She tried to tell me. Yes, but you're listening now. That's what matters. Emma had been crying quietly, face pressed against her mother's shoulder. Sarah had held her daughter with one arm, while the other hand had stayed wrapped around the water glass, white-knuckled. Marcus had approached the table, moved by something he usually kept locked down. His voice had been softer than Hawk had heard it in years. Ma'am, I have a daughter. She's 16 now. If anyone ever hurt her the way Kyle hurt Emma, I'd want to kill them. But I wouldn't, because killing them would mean going to prison, which would mean leaving my daughter without protection. So I do what you're going to do. Trust the system, let the law work, and make damn sure the predator never has the chance to hurt another child. Sarah had looked at him, this Iraq War veteran with scars on his arms and kindness in his eyes, and something in her face had shifted from shock toward determination. What happens now? Hawk had explained the process as gently as he could. Forensic interviews with specialists trained in child abuse cases, medical examinations, investigation by Child Protective Services, potential trial if Kyle didn't take a plea deal, months of stress and scrutiny and having to relive trauma over and over in official statements and depositions and possibly testimony. It's going to be hard, harder than anything you've done. People will question you. Some will take Kyle's side. His lawyer will try to discredit Emma, make her look unreliable. There will be days when you wonder if going through this is worse than what you were trying to escape. Sarah's voice had been barely audible. Will she be safe? From Kyle, yes. He's not getting bail on charges like this. From the process, we'll do everything we can to protect her. Why, you don't even know us. Hawk had paused, weighing how much to share, then decided truth mattered more than privacy. My little sister was 9 years old when her stepdad started abusing her. I was in Vietnam. She wrote me letters, but I was too deep in my own war to understand what she was really saying. By the time I came home, she'd learned that telling adults didn't help. They didn't believe her. When she finally reported it at 17, statute of limitations had passed. He walked free. She didn't. Overdosed at 23. The booth had gone silent. Even Emma had stopped crying, sensing the weight of what Hawk had just shared. I didn't save Kimmy, but I can help save Emma. That's why. Sarah had reached across the table, placed her hand over Hawk's. The gesture had lasted only a second before she'd pulled back, but it had carried gratitude that couldn't fit into words. The diner's clock had shown 09:14 hours. Less than 2 hours since Emma had appeared on the sidewalk. In that time, a predator had been arrested, a mother had learned the worst truth of her life, and a child had finally been believed after months of being dismissed as imaginative. Hawk's phone had buzzed. Text from Colonel Morrison, emergency meeting, VFW Hall, 1900 hours tonight. All available personnel. He'd typed back, confirmed. The next phase was beginning. Emma was safe from immediate threat, but the war wasn't over. It was just moving into different territory. Legal battles instead of physical ones. Testimony instead of combat. But warfare nonetheless requiring the same discipline and commitment and willingness to hold the line regardless of cost. Sarah had finally taken a sip of water. Emma had eaten half a cinnamon roll. Small victories, but victories nonetheless. Enough to build on. Hawk had stood aware that Sarah and Emma needed space, needed time to process without strangers hovering. He'd pulled a business card from his vest pocket, handwritten cell number on the back. You need anything, anything at all, you call that number. Day or night, we'll be there. Sarah had taken the card with shaking hands. Thank you, I don't know what else to say. You don't have to say anything, just take care of Emma. That's all that matters now. Hawk and his brothers had left the diner, stepping back into morning sunshine that felt different than it had at 0500 hours. The day had changed. The town had changed. They'd crossed a line from observation to action, and there was no going back. Marcus had spoken, first lighting a cigarette with hands that were steadier than his voice. Think Torres has enough to make charges stick. Emma's testimony, Sarah's corroboration. Mrs. Chen heard crying through the walls. Physical evidence will probably show signs of abuse. Yeah, he's got enough. Kyle's going to lawyer up. Expensive lawyer, probably. Doesn't matter. We did everything by the book. Called the police immediately. Didn't touch him. Documented everything. His lawyer can't claim vigilante justice when we follow procedure to the letter. Jax had been reviewing notes in his ever-present notebook. I've got times, locations, witness names, badge numbers, everything documented. If this goes to trial, prosecution will have a timeline that's airtight. Bear had been quieter than usual, his face showing the particular pain that came from remembering his own daughter. Finally, he'd spoken, voice rough. We saved one. Maybe we can't save them all, but we saved this one. That counts for something. It counted for everything, but Hawk hadn't said that out loud. Instead, he'd pulled on his helmet, kicked his Harley to life, and ridden back to the shop with the knowledge that in 1900 hours, they'd gather at the VFW hall and formalize what they'd just begun. Protecting Emma Morrison through whatever came next. Legal battles, CPS investigations, possible testimony, community backlash from people who wanted to believe Kyle was innocent because the alternative was too ugly to accept. They'd signed up for that fight the moment Hawk had knelt on a sidewalk and told a frightened child that he believed her. Some fights you couldn't walk away from, even when every instinct said the cost would be high. The VFW hall filled up fast that evening. Word had spread through the veteran network with the speed that only military communications could achieve. By 1900 hours, 43 men occupied the folding chairs ranging from Korean War to Afghanistan, ages 28 to 81. Different wars, same code. Colonel Morrison had called the meeting to order with a single sharp rap of his gavel. The room had fallen silent instantly, decades of conditioning, responding to command authority. Morrison's voice had carried the weight of his 81 years and 36 years leading this post. Gentlemen, this morning, 4 of our members intervened in a suspected child abuse situation. Jackson Cole and his unit acted with restraint, professionalism, and adherence to legal protocol. As a result, Kyle Morrison is currently in county lockup awaiting arraignment on multiple counts of child sexual abuse. A murmur had run through the room. Some of the men had heard about it already. Others were learning for the first time. Morrison had continued, his voice growing firmer. This is not the end of our involvement. This is the beginning. Emma Morrison is 8 years old. She has disclosed abuse and been believed. But she and her mother are about to enter a legal process that will be brutal. Defense attorneys will attack Emma's credibility. Community members will take sides. There may be attempts at intimidation or harassment. He'd paused, looking around the room at faces that had seen combat and knew what holding ground under fire meant. I am proposing we activate Protection Protocol Alpha. Full commitment, 24/7 coverage, witness protection, court testimony as needed. We become Emma Morrison's unit. We hold the line until the legal system delivers justice. Tom Hendricks had raised his hand. What about retaliation? Kyle's got family, friends, construction crew who probably think he's innocent. Torres had stood still in uniform from his shift. I'll be straight with you. There will be retaliation attempts. Probably starting with social media, escalating to harassment, possibly to direct confrontation. We need to document everything. Record everything. Build a case that shows any intimidation is part of a pattern. Marcus had spoken up. What's our rules of engagement? Someone threatens Sarah or Emma. What's our response? Colonel Morrison had answered that one himself. We are not vigilantes. We are witnesses. We are protectors. But we are also veterans who understand that sometimes protection requires presence. We make ourselves visible. We make ourselves available. We make it clear to anyone watching that Emma Morrison has a platoon backing her up. The vote had been unanimous. 43 hands raised. Protection Protocol Alpha activated. They'd spent the next hour organizing rotations, morning school runs, afternoon pickups, evening presence at Sarah's apartment, overnight security, every hour of every day covered by at least one veteran, usually 2. Hawk had taken operational command, organizing the unit the way he'd organized patrols in Vietnam, each man playing to his strengths. Marcus on tactical, Bear on medical and emotional support, Jax on documentation, Tom coordinating civilian business owner network, Torres as liaison with law enforcement. By 2100 hours, they'd had a complete battle plan. By 2130, they'd adjourned with the understanding that this wasn't temporary. This was commitment until trial conclusion, possibly longer if Emma needed continued support. Hawk had been walking to his bike when his phone had rung. Unknown number. He'd almost ignored it. Then something had made him answer. The voice on the other end had been smooth, professional, carrying the particular cadence of expensive legal education. Mr. Cole, this is Robert Brennan, attorney for Kyle Morrison. I think we should talk. I don't think we have anything to discuss. Oh, I disagree. See, I'm planning to file harassment charges against you and your motorcycle club. Unlawful detention, intimidation, interfering with parental rights. You surrounded my client's vehicle, prevented him from leaving, coerced testimony from a confused child. Hawk's voice had gone flat and cold. The tone he'd used had giving orders in combat zones where mistakes cost lives. We detained no one. We called law enforcement immediately. Everything was recorded on body cameras and civilian cell phones. Your client was arrested because an 8-year-old girl reported abuse and a deputy found probable cause. You want to play that in court, counselor? I welcome it. Brennan's tone had shifted, growing sharper. You have no idea who you're dealing with. I've been practicing law in this county for 23 years. I know every judge, every prosecutor, every potential juror, and I am very good at creating reasonable doubt. By the time I'm done, that little girl's credibility will be destroyed. Her mother will look negligent or vindictive. And you and your biker gang will look like vigilantes who manipulated a family crisis for your own purposes. You finished. I'm just getting started. You want a war? Mr. Cole, I'll give you a war, and I don't lose. The line had gone dead. Brennan hanging up, probably thinking he'd delivered a devastating threat that would make the bikers back off. Instead, Hawk had smiled, not from humor, from recognition. Some enemies announced themselves clearly, told you exactly what they planned to do, gave you time to prepare defenses and counterattacks. Those were the easy enemies, because you knew they were coming. He'd texted Colonel Morrison. Brennan called, threatened harassment charges, game on. Morrison's response had come back in 30 seconds. Let him come. We'll be ready. Hawk had ridden home through streets gone quiet with night, his mind already planning 3 moves ahead. Brennan thought this was about legal maneuvering, about creating doubt, about winning court cases. He didn't understand that veterans knew how to fight different kinds of wars. They'd held positions against overwhelming odds. They'd protected civilians in hostile territories. They'd carried wounded brothers out of kill zones. They'd faced enemies better armed, better funded, and better positioned. And they'd won. Not always, not every time, but enough times to know that determination mattered more than resources. That commitment counted more than tactics. That protecting the innocent was worth any cost. Emma Morrison had found her voice that morning on a sidewalk outside a diner. She'd spoken 3 words, "He touched me," and changed everything. Now she had 43 veterans standing between her and the predator's lawyer, standing between her and community doubt, standing between her and the possibility that the system would fail her the way it had failed so many before. Hawk had parked his bike in the shop's garage, climbed the stairs to his apartment, and stood at the window looking out over Main Street. The same view he'd watched at 0500 that morning. Same town, same streets, but different now. Because sometimes all it took was one child brave enough to speak and one person willing to believe her. The war was just beginning. Legal battles lay ahead. Character assassination, media scrutiny, community division, all of it predictable, all of it difficult, all of it worth fighting through because the alternative was letting another predator go free to find victim number 2. Hawk had finally opened the drawer in his nightstand, pulled out the photograph of his sister Kimberly, 23 years old in the picture, laughing at something outside the frame 3 months before the overdose that killed her. He'd spoken to her the way he had been doing for 30 years. Words that probably didn't reach anywhere, except the empty apartment, but helped anyway. I couldn't save you, Kimmy, but I'm going to save this one, I promise. The photograph had stayed on his nightstand, a reminder, a motivation, a memorial to every child who'd spoken truth and not been believed, to every victim who'd reported abuse and been ignored, to every survivor who'd carried scars that could have been prevented if someone had paid attention. Tomorrow would bring new challenges: CPS investigations, forensic interviews, legal maneuvering. But tonight Emma Morrison was sleeping somewhere safe, knowing that someone had believed her, that someone had acted, that the nightmare had at least one ending that didn't involve silence and suffering. That counted for something. It counted for everything. Hawk had finally gone to bed at 2300 hours, setting his alarm for 0500, because old habits died hard, and because morning would bring new battles that required preparation. He'd lain in the dark listening to the sounds of Milberthian at night, a siren somewhere distant, a dog barking the wind through the maple trees that lined Main Street, and found a kind of peace that had eluded him for 3 decades. Some wounds never healed, but sometimes you got a chance to stop the bleeding for someone else. Sometimes the war you couldn't win in the past gave you the skills to win a different war in the present. Emma Morrison would face hell in the coming months. Legal battles and testimony and cross-examination designed to destroy her credibility. But she wouldn't face it alone. She'd have a platoon of old warriors who'd signed up for worse tours and come home with the knowledge that some fights were worth any cost. The mission had begun. Hold the line until justice arrived. Protect the innocent, regardless of personal risk. Stand between predators and their victims with the kind of unwavering commitment that made enemies break before defenders did. Hawk had closed his eyes, and for the first time in years, he'd slept without dreaming of jungles and death and his sister's face asking why no one had believed her. Because today someone had believed, and that made all the difference. The Child Advocacy Center occupied a converted Victorian house on the edge of Millbrook's historic district, painted lavender, with white trim designed to look nothing like the bureaucratic processing facility it actually was. Hawk had driven Sarah and Emma there on day 3 post-arrest, his Harley leading a convoy that included Marcus on his bike and Bear in his pickup truck. Not subtle, not trying to be. The message to anyone watching this child moves under armed escort. The waiting room smelled like lavender air freshener, failing to mask institutional anxiety. Purple walls held crayon drawings from previous children, happy sons and smiling families that felt obscene given why anyone entered this building. Sarah sat rigid in a chair designed for comfort, her hands folded so tight the knuckles had gone bloodless. Emma pressed against her mother's side, small body vibrating with tension that 8-year-olds shouldn't carry. Dr. Rachel Kim had emerged from the interview room at precisely 0900 hours, her greeting warm but professional, the careful balance of someone trained to extract trauma without inflicting more. 40-something Korean-American, 15 years doing forensic interviews with child abuse victims. Her credentials hung framed in the hallway. Her competence showed in how she'd knelt to Emma's level without making it seem rehearsed. Emma, I'm Dr. Kim. My job is to listen to kids and help make sure they're safe. Your mom is going to wait right here, but she'll be able to see you through that window the whole time. Is that okay? Emma had looked at Hawk instead of her mother. Something had shifted in the past 3 days. Sarah represented safety that had failed. Hawk represented protection that had worked. The child's instincts had recalibrated accordingly. Hawk had given a small nod. Dr. Kim's good at her job. She's going to help. The interview room had cameras mounted in 3 corners, equipment designed to record everything while appearing non-threatening. Stuffed animals occupied a corner. Anatomically correct dolls waited on shelves. Drawing supplies covered a child-sized table. All the tools of a profession that shouldn't need to exist. Hawk and Sarah had watched from the observation room, separated by one-way glass in the unbridgeable distance between witness and victim. Deputy Torres had joined them, taking notes, his presence both official documentation and moral support. Dr. Kim's technique had been masterful. She'd started with easy questions. What grade are you in? What's your favorite subject? Do you have pets? Building rapport, establishing that this was a conversation, not an interrogation. Emma had answered in monosyllables, still guarded, still testing whether this adult could be trusted. The transition had come naturally, Kim's tone never shifting from gentle curiosity. Emma, you told some people that someone hurt you. Can you tell me about that? What had followed was 47 minutes of testimony that Hawk would carry for the rest of his life. Emma describing abuse in a child's vocabulary, using the words she knew, pointing to anatomical dolls when language failed. Dr. Kim asking careful, non-leading questions, giving Emma control over pacing, allowing silence when the child needed to gather courage. The timeline had emerged piece by piece. 6 months of systematic abuse, starting last March shortly after Sarah had begun working night shifts at the diner. Kyle coming to Emma's room after Sarah left for work. Emma locking her door, Kyle having a key. Emma's attempts to tell her mother dismissed as nightmares. The bathroom locks at school and the diner. The decision that morning to miss the bus because she couldn't pretend anymore. Specific details had accumulated. Kyle's Phillies jersey he'd worn most nights. The beer smell on his breath. The specific threats he'd used to ensure silence. The way he'd checked the driveway first, making sure Sarah's car was gone before entering Emma's room. Predator behavior, calculated and methodical. Sarah had broken halfway through, stumbling from the observation room to vomit in the hallway bathroom. The sounds of her retching had carried through thin walls. Hawk had followed, found her collapsed against the sink, face wet with tears and something beyond tears. I didn't protect her. I was right there in the house, and I didn't protect her. You were working, trying to provide. He exploited that. I should have known. Mothers are supposed to know. Hawk had chosen his words carefully, aware that guilt could be as destructive as the original trauma. You know now. That's what matters. Emma needs you present, not paralyzed. Sarah had straightened, slowly wiped her face with paper towels, returned to the observation room with the kind of determination that came from having no other choice. She'd watched her daughter describe horrors no mother should hear, and she'd stayed present for every word because that's what Emma needed. The medical examination had come next, conducted by Dr. Patricia Hendricks, pediatrician and Vietnam-era Navy nurse, who'd seen enough wartime trauma to recognize a civilian version. She'd been gentle, professional, explaining every step to Emma before touching her. The physical evidence had been consistent with Emma's account. Injuries that showed pattern, timeline, repetition, documentation that would hold up in any court. By noon, they'd been finished with the initial processing. Emma exhausted Sarah, hollow-eyed, Hawk's jaw aching from staying clenched through 3 hours of professionally delivered hell. They'd stopped at Miller's for lunch because Emma had asked to go there, some child's logic determining that the place where she'd first been believed was the safest place to exist. Linda had brought grilled cheese and tomato soup without asking what anyone wanted, comfort food deployed with the precision of a combat medic treating shock. Hawk's phone had buzzed halfway through the meal. Text from Jack's CPS investigator at Sarah's apartment. Inspection ongoing. Looks serious. The second front had opened while they had been dealing with the first. Susan Palmer from Child Protective Services had the particular combination of overwork and suspicion that came from a job where you saw the worst of humanity and had to document it in triplicate. She'd been waiting when they'd returned to Sarah's apartment, standing in the living room with a clipboard and the expression of someone who'd already made preliminary judgments. 38 years old, 10 years with CPS, 200 cases annually, budget cuts, meaning she averaged 45 minutes per investigation that should have taken 3 hours. The system was broken at structural level. Palmer was just the face of systemic failure. She turned when they'd entered, her voice carrying bureaucratic authority that felt like assault after the morning's trauma. Mrs. Morrison, we need to discuss Emma's living situation. Sarah had stiffened. What about it? You were working night shifts, leaving your daughter alone with a man now accused of sexually abusing her. That constitutes negligent supervision at minimum. I didn't know. He said he was helping. I trusted him. Palmer had made a note on her clipboard, the sound of pen on paper loud in the small apartment. 3 separate reports were filed with our office regarding Emma. One from her school counselor in March, an anonymous call from a neighbor in April, a concern from her pediatrician in June. Each time we conducted preliminary investigation, found no evidence of abuse, and closed the case. The words had landed like grenades. 3 chances to stop this. 3 failures. Hawk had stepped forward, keeping his voice level despite the rage building behind his sternum. Ma'am, if CPS received 3 reports and failed to investigate properly, that's systemic failure, not parental negligence. Palmer's eyes had narrowed at him. And you are Jackson Cole, VFW Post 312. We're providing protective services for Emma and her mother. Protective services from whom motorcycle club members aren't certified social workers. We're veterans ensuring a child abuse victim isn't left vulnerable while the system that failed her 3 times tries to take her away from her mother. Torres had intervened, his deputy's uniform carrying weight that civilian clothes couldn't. Susan, I know you're following protocol, but Emma disclosed abuse to Mr. Cole here. We arrested the perpetrator within an hour, and Sarah has been fully cooperative. What's the concern? Palmer had consulted her clipboard like it held answers instead of questions with checkboxes. Stability, support system, ability to protect the child going forward. Our policy requires supervised custody when a parent failed to prevent ongoing abuse in the home. The threat had been clear. Emma might be removed, placed in foster care, separated from her mother while the investigation proceeded. The system protecting children by traumatizing them further. Logic that made sense in policy manuals and destroyed families in practice. Sarah's voice had come out barely controlled. You're not taking my daughter. I'm recommending a custody hearing. Judge will make the final determination. You have 48 hours to demonstrate stable environment and adequate protection. If you can't, Emma will be placed in emergency foster care pending trial conclusion. Palmer had left with the efficiency of someone who'd delivered similar news dozens of times and couldn't afford to absorb the emotional impact. Sarah had collapsed onto the couch, her body folding in on itself like structure had been removed. Emma had stood in the doorway to her bedroom, taking in her mother's breakdown, understanding on some level that speaking truth had consequences that extended beyond Kyle's arrest. Hawk had made 3 phone calls in rapid succession. First to Colonel Morrison explaining the CPS situation. Second to Marcus activating emergency protocols. Third to a lawyer Marcus had mentioned knowing someone with experience in family law and victim advocacy. Kelly O'Brien had arrived at Sarah's apartment 90 minutes later, carrying a briefcase, and the bearing of someone who'd spent 30 years in military legal systems before transitioning to civilian practice. 55 years old, former Army JAG Corps specialist in military sexual assault cases who'd pivoted to victim advocacy after retirement. She'd prosecuted abusers in courts-martial and defended survivors in custody battles. Her credentials mattered less than the steel in her voice when she'd assessed the situation. CPS can recommend, judges decide. We're going to make sure the judge sees that Emma is safer with her mother and a veteran protection detail than she'd be in an overwhelmed foster system. She'd spent the next hour collecting documentation. Sarah's employment records showing stable income history, Emma's school attendance showing no educational neglect, medical records demonstrating regular checkups, character references from neighbors and employers. The building blocks of a defense against charges that shouldn't have been filed. Kelly had turned to Hawk as she'd been leaving, her expression shifting from professional to something more personal. Marcus tells me you run protection operations through the VFW. I need details. Schedules, personnel, training, background checks. Anything I can present to show this isn't random bikers playing vigilante, but organized veteran support. The next 48 hours had been war preparation of a different kind. Not loading weapons, but loading documents. Not planning ambushes, but planning testimony. The VFW hall had transformed into Operations Center, Colonel Morrison coordinating like he'd commanded companies in Korea. 27 veterans had signed up for protection rotations. Each one had submitted to background checks that Kelly had expedited through her military contacts. Each one had provided service records, VA documentation, character references. The wall had filled with schedules organized with military precision. Those 600 to 1200 Bear Wilson EMT, certified background check. Clear school drop-off, 1200, 1800 Jax Carter MP, background documentation specialist, after-school coverage. 1800, 2400 Marcus Reed, tactical training. Purple Heart recipient, evening, security. 2400, 600 Hawk, Cole. 2 tours, Vietnam, post commander. Overnight protection. The pattern repeated through the week, coverage gaps eliminated, redundancy built in, every hour accounted for. Not just protection, but documentation. Jax had created logs where each veteran would record observations, Emma's emotional state, any threats or concerns, building a paper trail that showed systematic care rather than haphazard intervention. Tom Hendricks had contributed by offering Sarah full-time employment at his hardware store. $15 per hour, health insurance, flexible schedule to accommodate Emma's needs. Financial stability demonstrated through payroll documentation. Linda Martinez had organized a meal train, 15 families signing up to provide dinners for 2 weeks, showing community support that extended beyond the veterans. CPS valued community integration. Kelly would use that. Mrs. Eleanor Chen had provided a notarized statement about hearing Emma crying through shared walls and her own failure to report earlier. Witness testimony establishing that warning signs had existed but been missed by multiple adults, not just Sarah. The custody hearing had been scheduled for 46 hours after Palmer's visit, emergency proceeding in family court with Judge Margaret Reeves presiding. Hawk had attended in his dress uniform, the first time he'd worn Marine Corps blues in 15 years. Marcus, Bear, and Jax had done the same. Colonel Morrison had appeared in Army dress uniform that still fit despite 81 years of wear. The courtroom had been smaller than Hawk had expected, wood-paneled walls and fluorescent lighting that made everyone look sick. Sarah had sat at the petitioner's table with Kelly Emma beside her mother, despite Palmer's objection. The child's presence mattered. Judges needed to see who they were deciding for. Palmer had presented her case, first clinical recitation of facts that painted Sarah as negligent parent who'd missed obvious signs. The three prior CPS reports had been entered as evidence documentation that concerns had been raised and insufficiently addressed. The argument had been procedurally sound and emotionally devastating. Kelly had countered with precision that came from 3 decades prosecuting military cases. She'd called Torres first his deputy's uniform, lending credibility, as he'd testified about the arrest, Emma's disclosure, Sarah's immediate cooperation. Then Dr. Kim explaining that Emma's testimony had been consistent and credible, showing no signs of coaching or false memory. Then Dr. Hendricks describing physical evidence consistent with Emma's account. The veterans had testified last, each one presenting different aspect of the protection plan. Bear's EMT background and child safety training, Jax's documentation protocols, and military police experience. Marcus's tactical security planning and Purple Heart showing he'd defended others under fire before. Colonel Morrison's 36 years leading VFW Post 312 and his Korean War Service, demonstrating long-term commitment to community protection. Hawk had been called last, Kelly saving him for maximum impact. He'd walked to the witness stand aware that everything depended on the next 5 minutes that a judge's decision made today would determine whether Emma stayed with her mother or got swallowed by a system that had already failed her 3 times. Kelly's questions had been sharp and purposeful. "Mr. Cole, why did you intervene when Emma approached you?" "I recognize signs of trauma from professional experience. I'm trained in combat medicine and crisis response. The child was in distress. Why not call CPS yourself rather than organizing veteran protection?" CPS had received 3 reports and closed all 3 cases. The system had already failed. I wasn't willing to risk a 4th failure. "What qualifies you to provide protection services?" 2 tours in Vietnam as combat medic, 45 years working with the veterans experiencing trauma, 30 years running VFW programs for at-risk families, and the knowledge that I failed to protect my own sister from similar abuse 30 years ago. I won't make that mistake twice. The last statement had been calculated risk personal disclosure that could seem emotionally compromised or deeply committed depending on how the judge received it. Kelly had coached him to include it. Judges were human. Motivation mattered. Judge Reeves had been 63, 20 years on family court, bench mother of 4, grandmother of 7. Her questions had been pointed and skeptical. "Mr. Cole, motorcycle clubs aren't typically known for child welfare advocacy. Why should I believe this is legitimate protection rather than vigilante intervention?" "Your Honor, every man in that rotation has been background checked. Everyone has signed legal documentation taking responsibility for Emma's safety. Every interaction is logged and documented. We're not hiding. We're providing support that the overwhelmed system can't deliver in time to prevent further trauma. And if I deny this petition, if I order Emma into foster care, then we'll respect the court's decision and work within whatever parameters are set. But I'd ask you to consider that Emma disclosed abuse, we responded appropriately, law enforcement acted, and the alleged perpetrator is in custody. Moving Emma now punishes the victim for having the courage to speak. The courtroom had gone silent after that, the kind of quiet that preceded verdicts. Judge Reeves had reviewed documents for what felt like hours, but had been 7 minutes. Then she looked up, her expression impossible to read. "Mrs. Morrison, you made serious errors in judgment. You dismissed your daughter's concerns. You trusted someone you should have questioned. Those failures had devastating consequences." Sarah had started to crumble, hearing the preamble to losing her daughter. "However, the record shows you acted immediately upon disclosure. You've cooperated fully with investigation. You've secured stable employment and housing, and you've accepted support from a veteran organization with documented capability to provide protection." The pivot in tone had been subtle but crucial. "Most significantly, Emma wants to stay with you. That matters. I'm denying CPS's petition for emergency foster care. Custody remains with mother under supervised conditions. VFW Post 312's protection protocols will continue for minimum 60 days subject to review. Ms. Palmer, your office will conduct weekly check-ins. Any concerns get reported immediately. Mr. Cole, if your organization fails to meet the standards you have outlined, here I will revisit this decision." "Understood." "Understood, Your Honor." The gavel had fallen, Emma staying with Sarah. The system working, barely held together by veterans who decided protecting children mattered more than the inconvenience of round-the-clock commitment. Outside the courthouse, Sarah had broken down in a different way, relief instead of despair, her body shaking as the adrenaline that had carried her through testimony finally released. Emma had clung to her mother with the particular desperation of a child who'd come within hours of being separated from the only parent who'd finally believed her. Kelly had pulled Hawk aside, her voice low and urgent. Brennan's going to escalate. He knows the veterans make our case stronger. He'll try to discredit you, break the protection network, isolate Sarah and Emma. Be ready. She'd been correct. The attack had come 24 hours later, but not from the direction anyone had expected. The Millbrook Gazette had published a front-page article that Brennan had clearly fed to a friendly reporter. The headline alone had been character assassination, motorcycle gang involvement raises questions in Morrison abuse case. The article had painted the veterans as vigilantes who'd surrounded Kyle's truck, prevented him from leaving, possibly coached Emma's testimony. Unnamed sources suggesting Hawk and his crew had history of anti-authority behavior. Innuendo masquerading as journalism. The social media explosion had been worse. Someone had created a Facebook page called Justice for Kyle Morrison that had gained 300 followers overnight. Posts claiming Emma was confused, Sarah was vindictive, the bikers were intimidating witnesses. The comments section had devolved into warfare between people who believed Emma and people who couldn't accept that predators lived among them. Hawk's phone had started receiving calls from numbers he didn't recognize. Most hung up when he answered. A few delivered threats. One had been explicit enough that Jax had documented it, traced the number, filed a police report for harassment and witness intimidation. Sarah's phone had been worse. Calls from Kyle's family members accusing her of ruining a good man's life. Messages calling Emma a liar. Voicemails suggesting Sarah was coaching her daughter for money. The particular cruelty that people deployed when they'd rather blame victims than accept uncomfortable truth. The veterans had responded by tightening security. Marcus had installed cameras at Sarah's apartment, documenting everyone who approached. Jax had created social media accounts to counter misinformation, posting carefully worded corrections that cited court documents and official statements. Tom Hendricks had organized business owners on Main Street to refuse service to anyone making threats against Sarah or Emma. Old-fashioned community accountability. But Brennan's most effective move had been legal rather than social. He'd filed formal harassment charges against Hawk, Marcus, Bear, and Jax, alleging unlawful detention, intimidation, and interference with parental rights. The charges were procedurally weak but strategically brilliant. They forced the veterans to defend themselves, diverting resources and attention. They created optics of criminality that contaminated the narrative. They gave Brennan discovery rights that let him dig into the veterans' backgrounds, looking for anything to undermine credibility. Kelly had taken the harassment case pro bono, her JAG background making her perfect defender for veterans facing bogus legal attacks. She'd filed motions to dismiss, arguing that body camera footage showed the veterans had done nothing illegal, that they'd called police immediately, that they'd never prevented Kyle from leaving but simply positioned themselves as witnesses to prevent flight before law enforcement arrived. The preliminary hearing had been scheduled for 2 weeks out. Until then, the charges hung over everything, Brennan's strategy working exactly as intended, creating doubt, dividing community, making it harder to maintain the narrative that veterans had heroically protected an endangered child. The breaking point had come on day 12, not from external attacks but internal pressure. Emma had returned to school after a week's absence, Sarah having kept her home during the custody hearing aftermath. The decision to send her back had been difficult, weighing education against exposure, but isolating her seemed worse than reintegration. Bear had driven her to Millbrook Elementary at 07:45, walking her to the entrance, establishing visible presence that said this child moves under protection. Emma had gone to her third-grade classroom with the tentative hope of children who wanted to believe things could return to normal. The call had come at 11:47, school counselor's number showing on Bear's phone. Emma had locked herself in a bathroom stall, wouldn't come out, was having what sounded like a panic attack. Bear had arrived within 8 minutes, Marcus 3 minutes behind him as backup. They'd found Emma in the nurse's office, face blotchy from crying hands, shaking the counselor. Mr. Davis looking helpless in the face of trauma his education hadn't prepared him for. It had taken 20 minutes to get the story. Tyler Morrison, Kyle's nephew, 10 years old, and certain his uncle was innocent, had organized a campaign. Liar written on Emma's desk in marker. Other kids whispering accusations during recess. Someone had printed out posts from the Justice for Kyle Facebook page and left them in Emma's cubby. Third-grade warfare using adult weapons. Principal Sharon Mills had been apologetic and ineffective in equal measure, promising to address bullying, implement consequences, monitor the situation. Empty promises from an administrator who meant well, but lacked resources or authority to protect a child caught in the crossfire of community division. Bear had made a decision on the spot, the kind that required no consultation because it was obvious to anyone who understood protection protocols. Emma wasn't returning to school until the trial concluded. Sarah would homeschool with assistance from volunteers. Emma's safety mattered more than curriculum standards. Principal Mills had started to object, mentioning truancy laws and educational requirements, but something in Bear's face had stopped her. Maybe she'd seen the EMT who'd saved 14 lives and failed to save his own daughter. Maybe she'd recognized that some men drew lines they wouldn't cross, and defending those lines meant accepting confrontation. Whatever she'd seen, she'd step back and let Bear take Emma home. The drive back had been quiet. Emma pressed against the passenger door, small body vibrating with shame and fear that shouldn't belong to 8-year-olds. Bear had known better than to offer empty reassurance. Sometimes silence was the only honest response to situations that had no good answers. Sarah had been at work when they'd arrived back at the apartment, Weem having given her the morning shift after the custody hearing stress. Hawk had been there on his rotation, using the time to review documents Kelly needed for the harassment defense. He'd taken one look at Emma's face and understood everything without explanation. Emma had gone to her room, closed the door, and cried with the kind of soul-deep exhaustion that came from being 8 years old and carrying an adult-sized trauma. Hawken and Bear had sat in the living room, not talking, two veterans who'd seen variations of this same scene in war zones and stateside and had never gotten used to children suffering for things they hadn't caused. Bear had finally spoken, his voice rough with pain that had nothing to do with Emma and everything to do with his daughter Rebecca, who'd died 5 years ago after her boyfriend had done things Bear had found out about too late. "I'm done being gentle about this. Kyle Morrison deserves worse than prison." "Yes, but prison is what he's getting. Because we did it right. Right doesn't feel like enough when kids are crying. It's all we've got. We start doing it wrong and we become what Brennan's trying to paint us as." Bear had nodded, accepting the logic without embracing it, the eternal frustration of men who'd learned that following rules produce better outcomes than breaking them, but wish the universe would occasionally allow exceptions for people who really deserve summary justice. Hawk's phone had buzzed. Text from Jack's anonymous tip just came in. Woman claims Kyle abused her daughter 10 years ago. Wants to talk. Meeting tonight, 1900 hours, VFW Hall. The second victim had found her courage. Jessica Rodriguez had walked into the VFW Hall at precisely 1900 hours, 24 years old, carrying herself with the careful posture of someone who'd learned that the world wasn't safe, but had decided to exist in it anyway. She'd worn business casual clothes that suggested an office job and a life that functioned on surface level. Her eyes had told different story, the particular wariness of people who'd survived predators and knew they could be anywhere. Colonel Morrison had greeted her with the gentle formality of a man who'd spent 60 years understanding that some visitors required extra care. He'd offered coffee, directed her to a comfortable chair, gathered the core group, Hawk, Marcus, Bear, Jax, Torres, into a conference room that offered privacy without intimidation. Jessica had set her purse on the table with deliberate care, buying time while she gathered courage to speak words she'd probably been rehearsing for days. "My name is Jessica Rodriguez. 12 years ago, Kyle Morrison dated my mother for 8 months. I was 13 years old." The words had landed like ordnance, everyone in the room understanding immediately what came next, but letting her tell it at her own pace. "He started coming to my room 3 months into dating my mom, always when she was asleep or working evening shifts. He said it was normal that fathers and daughters did these things, that I should keep it secret because people wouldn't understand. I was 13. I believed him." Her voice had stayed level, the product of years of therapy and processing, but her hands had shaken around her coffee cup. "I tried to tell my mom once. She didn't believe me. Said I was jealous of her relationship, that I was acting out because I missed my real dad. Kyle heard about it and told her I had mental health issues, that I needed therapy for my delusions. She sent me to a therapist who treated me for oppositional defiant disorder instead of abuse. Torres had leaned forward, his cop instincts engaged. Did you ever file a report? When I turned 21. Finally understood what had happened, that it wasn't my fault, that I needed to do something. Went to the police station, filed formal complaint. Detective told me statute of limitations had expired. 8 years since the last incident. Pennsylvania law said too much time had passed. So he faced no consequences. None. The detective was kind about it, said he believed me, but legally there was nothing they could do. I left that police station understanding that Kyle was free to do it again to someone else. Jessica had looked directly at Hawk, then her expression carrying something between plea and challenge. When I saw the news about Emma, about the arrest, I knew. Same pattern, single mother, young daughter. Move and gain trust, wait for opportunity. I did research after my case was closed. Found 3 other women online whose daughters reported similar stories about Kyle Morrison. Nobody could prove anything. Nobody got justice. The weight of systematic predation had settled over the room. Not isolated incident, but repeated pattern. Kyle Morrison moving through families like territory, exploiting and escaping, leaving damaged children in his wake, while the system repeatedly failed to stop him. Marcus had asked the question everyone was thinking. Will you testify? If this goes to trial, will you tell your story in court? Jessica had taken a breath, held it, released it slowly. That's why I'm here. My case can't be prosecuted, statute of limitations. But it can establish pattern. Show Emma isn't confused or lying or making things up. Show Kyle Morrison has been doing this for at least 12 years. I'll testify. I'll do whatever it takes to make sure Emma gets the justice I couldn't get. Kelly O'Brien had arrived halfway through Jessica's statement, having been called by Colonel Morrison when the meeting had started. She'd listened to the rest with the focus of a prosecutor who just received gift-wrapped evidence. After Jessica had finished, Kelly had explained how pattern testimony worked. Prior bad acts weren't usually admissible in criminal trials. Juries weren't supposed to hear that a defendant had committed similar crimes before, but Pennsylvania law allowed pattern testimony in sexual abuse cases, especially with child victims, because predators operated systematically. Jessica's testimony would show Emma wasn't an isolated victim, but part of established behavior pattern. This changes everything. Brennan can attack one victim. He can't attack 2 victims with identical stories spanning 12 years, especially when one already reported years ago and gained nothing from coming forward. Jessica had stayed for another hour, providing details, timelines, specific facts that Kelly would need. She'd left with the understanding that she'd just volunteered to have her own trauma examined in public court, cross-examined by an attorney who tried to destroy her credibility, used as weapon in a legal battle that would cost her emotionally regardless of outcome. After she'd gone, the room had been silent for full Minutemen, processing what they had heard and what it meant. Torres had spoken first, his voice carrying the weight of 15 years in law enforcement and the bitter knowledge that the system he'd sworn to uphold had failed catastrophically. 3 other families. He said 3 other women reported similar stories. That's 5 victims we know about. How many more that we don't? Colonel Morrison had answered with the grim certainty of someone who'd commanded men in combat and understood how evil operated when unchecked. Predators don't stop voluntarily. They escalate until they're caught. If Kyle's been doing this for 12 years, Emma isn't victim 5. She's probably victim 15. We just don't know about the others because they never found courage to speak or never found anyone who believed them. The implications had hung heavy. 12 years, multiple families, a system that received reports and closed cases, schools that saw warning signs but didn't act, neighbors who heard things but stayed silent, the collective failure that let one predator operate freely for over a decade. Hawk had felt the familiar rage building, the kind that had no productive outlet, that demanded action, but offered no target except the legal process they were already engaged in. He'd learned in Vietnam that rage without purpose destroyed the person feeling it. The mission was justice, not vengeance. Keep walking that line, even when every instinct screamed for more direct solution. His phone had buzzed. Sarah calling, her voice barely controlled when he'd answered. I just got fired, Linda called, said the diner's getting too many complaints. Customers uncomfortable. Kyle's family threatening boycott. She said she's sorry, but she can't afford to lose business. I'm done, effective immediately. The economic warfare had arrived. Brennan's strategy, working through proxies, make Sarah's life unsustainable. create financial pressure, force her to choose between fighting for justice and keeping food on the table. Hawk had kept his voice steady, projecting calm he didn't feel. Tom's offer still stands. Hardware store job. Start Monday if you want. That's not the point. They're going to destroy me. Every job, every friend, every piece of stability. Because I chose my daughter over silence. Yes, that's how it works. System rewards silence and punishes courage. But you're not alone. We've got your back, and Tom's got a job waiting, and you will survive this because Emma needs you to. The call had ended with Sarah's agreement to meet with Tom the next morning, practical survival overriding emotional devastation. Hawk had texted Kelly about the firing, documenting another incident of retaliation that could potentially become witness intimidation charge if they could prove coordination with Brennan's office. The war had been raging for 12 days. Child rescued predator arrested mother's custody maintained, second victim emerged. But costs were accumulating. Sarah fired. Emma traumatized at school. Veterans facing harassment charges. Community divided. And somewhere in a county jail cell, Kyle Morrison sat with expensive lawyer in growing confidence that the system might still fail to convict him. Day 15 had brought the revelation that changed everything arrived in the form of Deputy Torres walking into the VFW hall at 2100 hours with an expression that combined devastation and determination in equal measure. He'd asked for privacy. Hawk Colonel Morrison, Marcus Bear Jackson Kelly had convened in the back office. Torres had stood there for a moment, cop's composure cracking at the edges, father's pain bleeding through professional armor. I need to tell you something about my daughter, Melissa. She's 27, lives in Pittsburgh, works as social worker. I haven't told her about the Morrison case because I didn't want her dragged into it. He'd paused, struggling with words. She called me 2 hours ago, saw the news coverage, said she needed to tell me something she should have said 15 years ago. The understanding had hit Hawk immediately, the pattern emerging with terrible clarity. Torres had continued, his voice breaking on certain words. 15 years ago, Kyle Morrison dated my ex-wife for a year. I was deployed in Iraq for most of it. Melissa was 12, living with her mother. Kyle, he'd stopped, unable to continue for a moment, a father confronting his worst nightmare retroactively. Kyle abused her, repeatedly, for 8 months. She never told anyone. Not her mother, not me. She was ashamed, scared. Thought if a cop's daughter couldn't be safe, what did that say about her? The silence in that office had been absolute, the kind that preceded volcanic eruptions or building collapses. She kept a diary, detailed entries, dates, times, specific descriptions. Saved it all these years in a safe deposit box. She wants to testify, wants to give Emma what she never got, justice. Kelly's legal mind had engaged, immediately processing the implications. Contemporaneous written documentation from a law enforcement officer's daughter. That's not just pattern testimony. That's evidence that would survive any challenge. Brennan can't dismiss that. Torres had pulled a key from his pocket, set it on the desk. Safe deposit box, Bank of Pennsylvania downtown branch. Melissa authorized me to retrieve the diary. She's driving down from Pittsburgh tomorrow to meet with you, give full statement, prepare testimony. The pieces had clicked together. 3 victims, spanning 15 years. 2 with delayed reporting, explained by shame and fear. 1 with physical diary evidence proving contemporaneous disclosure. Patterns so clear that even the most skeptical jury would see it. Brennan's strategy had been to destroy Emma's credibility, paint her as confused child coached by vindictive mother and vigilante bikers. That strategy required isolating Emma, making her the single source of accusation. 3 victims shattered that isolation completely. Colonel Morrison had stood moved to Torres, placed a hand on the deputy's shoulder with the gravity of one combat veteran acknowledging another's pain. Ray, I'm sorry. For your daughter, for what you didn't know, for having to learn this now. Torres had nodded, unable to speak for a moment, the cost of this revelation still settling into his bones. Hawk had understood something in that moment that he'd seen before in military units. This wasn't just about protecting Emma anymore. This was about 3 daughters who'd been failed by systems designed to protect them. This was about fathers who'd unknowingly let predators into their homes. This was about mothers who trusted wrong men. This was about collective failure that could only be redeemed through collective action. The mission parameters had expanded. Not just one child's justice, but three victims' vindication. Not just one predator's conviction, but systemic change that prevented this from happening to victim 16. Melissa Torres had arrived the next afternoon driving down from Pittsburgh, carrying burdens she'd carried privately for 15 years. She'd met with Kelly in the VFW conference room, bare present, as emotional support and witnessed a testimony that would eventually be formalized in deposition. She'd been 27 but looked older the way survivors often did trauma-aging people, in ways that had nothing to do with birthdays. Professional clothes, social worker, credentials, the life she'd built, despite what had been stolen from her. Proof that survival was possible, even when justice wasn't. Her testimony had been clinical, the product of her own therapy and professional training, helping her narrate trauma without being consumed by it. The diary entries had been devastating in their childish handwriting and mature understanding of violation. 12-year-old Melissa hadn't fully comprehended what was being done to her, but had known it was wrong, had documented it with a desperate hope that someday someone would believe her. Kelly had recorded everything, prepared documentation, begun the legal process of entering Melissa as additional witness for prosecution. The DA's office had been notified. Grand jury proceedings were being prepared. The case against Kyle Morrison was becoming airtight, but sitting in the VFW hall that evening, watching Melissa cry through her testimony while her father stood outside, unable to bear witness to his own failure, Hawk had understood that legal victory wouldn't erase what had been lost. 3 childhoods, 15 years of silence, countless other victims who'd never found courage to speak. Emma Morrison would get justice. Jessica Rodriguez would get validation. Melissa Torres would get vindication. But none of them would get back what had been stolen. That night, alone in his apartment above the shop, Hawk had pulled out the photograph of his sister Kimberly again. Looked at her laughing face, frozen at age 16, 3 years before everything had fallen apart. He'd made a promise 2 weeks ago. Save Emma when he couldn't save Kimmy. That promise had expanded to include Jessica and Melissa, and however many others existed in the shadows, unnamed victims of a predator who'd operated freely for too long. The trial was coming. Brennan would bring every weapon in his considerable arsenal. The defense would be vicious and personal and designed to destroy 3 women who'd already been destroyed once. The veterans would hold the line, providing protection and support and witness to courage that most people would never need to display. But tonight, day 16 in a war that would last months, Hawk allowed himself one moment of grief for all the children who'd spoken and not been heard, who'd reached out and found emptiness, who'd carried secrets that crushed them because the adults who should have protected them filed. Then he set Kimberly's photograph back on the nightstand, turned off the light, and prepared for tomorrow's battles. The mission continued. Emma, Jessica, and Melissa needed warriors who wouldn't quit regardless of cost. Some wars you fought for victory. Some you fought because the alternative was unthinkable. This was the second kind. The VFW hall had been converted into something between war room and sanctuary, tactical planning meeting, emotional support, in the space where veterans gathered to remember battles they'd survived. 3 weeks before trial, Kelly O'Brien had commandeered the main conference room, covering walls with timelines and witness lists and anticipated defense strategies. The smell of old coffee and older memories mixed with new purpose as she'd outlined what came next. Emma Morrison sat in a chair designed for adults' feet, not quite reaching the floor, flanked by her mother and a woman she'd met yesterday who told her they'd both survived the same monster. Jessica Rodriguez had driven from her apartment in Philadelphia for this preparation, understanding that her presence mattered almost as much as her testimony. Melissa Torres sat across the table, having taken leave from her social work job in Pittsburgh, her father standing behind her with the protective posture of a man trying to prevent harm 15 years too late. Kelly had started with the hardest truth, her voice carrying the authority of someone who'd prosecuted enough abuse cases to know that honesty served victims better than false comfort. Emma, you're going to have to tell your story again, in a courtroom, with Kyle sitting 15 feet away. His lawyer is going to ask you questions designed to confuse you, to make you doubt yourself, to make you seem unreliable. It's going to be the hardest thing you've ever done. Emma's voice had come out small but steady. 9 years old now, 3 months of therapy having taught her that speaking truth was strength even when it hurt. Will people believe me this time? Some will, some won't. That's why we prepare. So you know exactly what to expect and how to handle it. The preparation had been systematic, almost military in structure. Kelly had transformed the VFW hall into a mock courtroom, complete with witness stand and jury box filled with volunteers, veterans' wives who'd raised children and understood what believing victims required. The goal wasn't to rehearse scripted answers, but to desensitize Emma to the environment, make the courtroom feel familiar instead of threatening. Week 1 had focused on building confidence through friendly questioning. Kelly playing prosecutor, asking general questions, while Emma practiced speaking clearly, making eye contact, admitting when she didn't remember details rather than guessing. The volunteers had played attentive jury, offering encouraging smiles, showing Emma that telling truth could result in being heard rather than dismissed. Week 2 had shifted to cross-examination preparation, Kelly adopting Brennan's anticipated tactics, suggesting Emma was confused, implying her mother had coached her, questioning whether she understood the difference between appropriate affection and abuse. The questions had been brutal by design, Emma crying through some sessions, but learning that tears didn't invalidate truth, that emotional responses were normal and acceptable. Hawk had watched from the back of the room during these sessions, his presence requested by Emma, who'd said she felt safer when he was there. He'd seen combat veterans break under interrogation techniques gentler than what Kelly was deploying, but Emma had kept returning, kept practicing, kept finding strength in repetition that transformed unknown terrors into manageable challenges. Jessica and Melissa had undergone similar preparation, though their sessions had been separate and more abbreviated. Adult witnesses required different handling, but Kelly had been thorough about warning them that Brennan would attack their credibility question. Their timing suggests financial motives or attention-seeking behavior. Both women had survived their respective preparation sessions with the grim determination of people who had already endured worse and refused to be broken again. The strategy session had come on week 3, Colonel Morrison, presiding over a council that included Kelly Torres, the core veteran unit Tom Hendricks, and Judge Reeves's law clerk, who'd been willing to provide unofficial guidance on what the judge would allow. The war room had been covered in evidence photographs, timeline charts, witness statements, everything organized with precision that would have impressed any military command center. Kelly had outlined prosecution strategy using a whiteboard that filled with names and arrows showing testimony flow. The goal was building narrative momentum, starting with procedural witnesses who established facts, moving through emotional testimony that showed pattern, culminating with Emma's account as the centerpiece that everything else supported. Day 1 would establish scene and response. Deputy Torres, describing the arrest body camera footage showing Emma's initial disclosure, Dr. Kim explaining forensic interview protocols. Foundation building, creating credibility before introducing victims whose testimony would be challenged. Day 2 would introduce pattern through Jessica's testimony, showing this wasn't isolated incident but established behavior. Then Mrs. Chenna's neighbor witness, someone with no stake except guilty conscience about not reporting sooner. Building toward Melissa's testimony without revealing it, yet saving the bombshell for maximum impact. Day 3 would be Melissa, the daughter of a cop, testifying about abuse that happened under her father's roof while he'd been deployed protecting strangers overseas. The diary would be entered as evidence, 12-year-old handwriting, proving contemporaneous disclosure rather than recovered memory or coach statement. The emotional apex before Emma took the stand. Day 4 would belong to Emma, the victim whose courage had started everything. Kelly had been frank about this being the most critical testimony, the moment when jury would either embrace Emma's truth or retreat into doubt that let them avoid uncomfortable conclusions about predators who looked like neighbors and coached Little League. Marcus had asked the tactical question that everyone had been thinking. What's Brennan's play? He's too smart to just attack the victims head-on. That'll make him look like he's bullying children. Kelly had smiled without humor, the expression of someone who'd faced opponents like Brennan before and understood their playbook. He'll go after credibility through suggestion rather than direct attack. Imply Emma's confused rather than calling her a liar. Question timing rather than accusing Jessica and Melissa of fabrication. Paint the veterans as vigilantes who manipulated the situation. Create doubt through insinuation. Let the jury do the work of dismissing testimonies without him having to say the ugly parts out loud. How do we counter that? By being prepared for every angle, by having Emma stay calm under pressure, by showing that 3 victims with identical stories across 15 years isn't coincidence, and by trusting that at least some jurors will have the courage to believe children over comfortable denial. The meeting had adjourned with assignments distributed, everyone clear on their role. Hawk had been given oversight of witness transport and security, ensuring Sarah, Emma, Jessica, and Melissa got to courthouse safely each day without harassment. Marcus would coordinate with Torres on evidence chain of custody. Bear would handle emotional support, his EMT training, and gentle presence, making him ideal for managing stress responses. Jax would document everything, creating backup records in case official documentation somehow disappeared. Colonel Morrison had stayed after the others left, alone with Hawk in the conference room that still smelled like strategy and coffee. "You ready for this, son?" "Ready as I'll ever be." "That's not what I asked. You're carrying weight. Your sister, these girls, every victim, whoever wasn't believed. You can't save them all retroactively through Emma's trial." Hawk had been quiet for a moment, understanding that Morrison saw more than most people. That 81 years in Korea and 36 years leading veterans had taught him to recognize when soldiers were fighting old wars alongside new ones. "I know, but I can save this one. That has to be enough." "Will it be if the jury acquits, if Brennan wins, if Emma goes through this hell, and Kyle walks free? Will you be able to live with having done everything right and still failing?" The question had lodged in Hawk's chest like shrapnel, the kind you carried forever, because removing it would cause more damage than leaving it buried. "I'll have to. What other choice is there?" Morrison had nodded, satisfied that Hawk understood the stakes included his own sanity and wasn't pretending otherwise. "Then let's make sure Emma wins, for her sake and maybe for your sister's memory." The night before trial, Hawk had taken the overnight security rotation at Sarah's apartment, positioned in the living room with clear sight lines to both entrances and Emma's bedroom door. The protocol had become routine over 3 months, veterans rotating through documenting incidents, maintaining presence that said this family moves under protection. Emma had appeared in her doorway at 0200 hours, small figure, in pajamas covered with cartoon characters, unable to sleep, despite exhaustion that showed in the shadows under her eyes. Hawk had gestured to the couch beside him, not making her ask for company. She'd sat down carefully, maintaining distance, but close enough to feel protected. "Can't sleep. I keep thinking about tomorrow, about having to see him again." "That's normal. Fear means you understand what's at stake, means you're smart, not weak." "What if I mess up? What if I say something wrong and they don't believe me?" Hawk had chosen his words with the care of someone who understood that what he said now would matter more than any preparation session. "You won't mess up. But even if you stumble, even if you cry, or get confused or need breaks, that doesn't make your truth less true. You're 9 years old, Emma. You're not supposed to be perfect under pressure. You're supposed to be honest. That's all anyone can ask." "Mr. Hawk, did you ever have to do something really scary in the war?" "Every single day." "How did you make yourself do it?" He'd looked at her, then this child who'd been forced to develop courage most adults never needed, and had felt the weight of answering honestly. "I remembered why I was fighting. Wasn't for medals or country or anything grand like that. Was for the guys next to me, for the people back home who couldn't defend themselves. You're doing the same thing tomorrow. You're fighting for every little girl Kyle might hurt next if someone doesn't stop him. You're a soldier, Emma. You just don't wear a uniform." She'd been quiet for a moment, processing that comparison, trying it on to see if it fit. "When it gets scary tomorrow, when I want to run away, can I look at you? I'll be right there in the back row. Same place I've been at every hearing. You look at me, I'll nod, and you'll remember you're not alone. Deal?" "Deal." Emma had stayed on the couch for another hour, not talking, just existing in the same space as someone who believed her without requiring constant reassurance. Eventually, she'd fallen asleep there, and Hawk had covered her with a blanket while maintaining his security position, protecting both the physical space and the trust that had developed between a child survivor and an old warrior who'd finally found a battle worth fighting. Millbrook County Courthouse dated back to 1887. Stone facade and copper roof oxidized to green patina, the kind of building designed to project permanence and authority. The courtroom on the second floor had been modernized over decades but retained original wood paneling and high ceilings that made voices echo. Judge Patricia Mendez presided from an elevated bench, 63 years old and 20 on family court, her reputation for thoroughness, earning respect from prosecutors and defense attorneys equally. The jury had been seated after 2 days of voir dire that Brennan had used to eliminate anyone with military connections or child protection advocacy backgrounds. What remained were 7 women and 5 men ranging from a 28-year-old accountant to a 71-year-old retired teacher, theoretically impartial, but realistically bringing whatever biases and experiences they carried into deliberation. The gallery had filled quickly on opening day, public interest running high in a case that combined child abuse, motorcycle clubs, and small-town drama. Media had been restricted by the judge. Only sketch artists and one pool reporter allowed, protecting Emma's identity while permitting public accountability. The back row was occupied entirely by veterans in dress uniform: Hawk Marcus Bear, Jax, Colonel Morrison, Tom Hendricks, and 6 others who'd rotated through protection duty. A wall of old warriors in service ribbons and polished brass, silent testimony to Emma's support system. Kelly O'Brien had dressed in navy blues, her own service record on display, establishing that she spoke for victims as a veteran who defended the accused in military courts and knew the difference between procedural rights and tactical manipulation. She'd approached the jury box for opening statement with the bearing of someone who'd prosecuted worse cases and won them through preparation rather than theatrics. Her voice had carried clearly in the echoing courtroom, each word chosen for precision and impact. Ladies and gentlemen, Kyle Morrison spent 15 years perfecting his predatory skills. He targeted single mothers who worked hard and needed help. He presented himself as reliable, supportive, trustworthy. He waited until families let their guard down. Then he exploited access to children who'd been taught to trust him. Emma Morrison, Jessica Rodriguez, Melissa Torres, 3 victims across 15 years, all describing identical pattern. This isn't coincidence. This is how predators operate. They don't announce themselves. They infiltrate, and they rely on communities choosing comfortable denial over uncomfortable truth. She'd paused, making eye contact with each juror, ensuring they understood this case would require courage from them as much as the victims. You will hear from Emma Morrison, 9 years old, who found the bravery to speak when her own mother initially dismissed her concerns. You'll hear from 2 women who survived Kyle Morrison's abuse years ago and are testifying to prevent victim number 4. You'll hear from law enforcement medical experts, forensic specialists. And you'll hear from defense attorney Robert Brennan, who will try to convince you that 3 children across 15 years all confused appropriate affection with abuse. That's not reasonable doubt. That's choosing comfort over justice. Brennan had risen for his opening statement with the smooth confidence of someone who'd been practicing law longer than most of the jurors had been alive. 61 years old, expensive suit, silver hair, styled to suggest distinguished authority. He'd positioned himself not as defender of predator, but protector of justice system that required burden of proof. His voice had been measured, reasonable, inviting jurors to embrace skepticism as wisdom rather than cruelty. Innocent until proven guilty. Those words aren't just legal formula. They're protection against mob mentality. Kyle Morrison is innocent. He maintains his innocence. And the state must prove guilt beyond reasonable doubt. Not beyond some doubt, beyond reasonable doubt. You will hear from an 8-year-old child, now 9, who struggles to distinguish fantasy from reality. Her teachers will testify to this. You'll hear from 2 women who waited years to suddenly remember abuse, conveniently timing their accusations after seeing media coverage. And you'll hear from a motorcycle club that surrounded my client's vehicle, prevented him from leaving, and possibly coached testimony to validate their vigilante intervention. By trial's end, you'll have reasonable doubt. And when you do, you must acquit. The opening statements had set the battlefield, Kelly establishing pattern and courage, Brennan establishing doubt and procedure. What came next would determine which narrative prevailed. Deputy Torres had taken the stand first, his uniform carrying weight that civilian clothes couldn't, his testimony methodical recitation of response protocol. He described arriving at scene, conducting preliminary interview with Emma, observing 4 veterans in protective positions around the child without physically restraining Kyle Morrison. The body camera footage had been played, grainy video capturing Emma's voice, saying those 3 devastating words, "He touched me." Brennan's cross-examination had been sharp, trying to establish that the veteran's presence had been intimidating, that Emma might have been coached during the 4 minutes before Torres arrived. But Torres had held firm, his military background, giving him comfort under hostile questioning. His testimony, supported by video evidence that showed timeline, didn't allow for coaching. Dr. Rachel Kim had followed explaining forensic interview protocols designed specifically to prevent false allegations. She described using anatomically correct dolls, asking open-ended questions, documenting Emma's body language and emotional responses. Her professional opinion had been unequivocal. Emma's testimony showed all markers of truthful disclosure and none of coached fabrication. Brennan had attacked her credentials during cross-examination, suggesting forensic child psychology was soft science prone to confirmation bias. But Dr. Kim had been prepared, citing peer-reviewed research and her 15 years experience interviewing hundreds of children, her credibility surviving the assault. Mrs. Eleanor Chen had been the day's emotional centerpiece, 73 years old, and carrying guilt about her own inaction. Her testimony about hearing crying through shared walls had been devastating in its simplicity. When Kelly had asked why she hadn't reported earlier, Mrs. Chen's answer had resonated through the courtroom. "I was afraid. I told myself it wasn't my business. I was wrong. I will regret that cowardice for the rest of my life." Brennan had tried to suggest her hearing was impaired by age, that she couldn't distinguish nightmare crying from other crying through walls. Mrs. Chen had looked at him with the kind of quiet strength that came from having survived worse things than lawyers' condescension. "I raised 4 daughters in Korea during war. I know sound of child in pain. That was sound I heard." The jury had absorbed her testimony with visible emotion, 2 women in the front row wiping tears. First day had ended with prosecution establishing credible foundation, Brennan's attacks landing, but not destroying. Day 2 had opened with Jessica Rodriguez, 24 years old, business casual attire, carrying herself with the careful composure of someone who'd spent years in therapy learning to function despite trauma. Kelly had walked her through testimony, methodically establishing timeline, describing Kyle's identical pattern 12 years earlier, explaining why she'd waited to report and why she was testifying now. The courtroom had been silent, as Jessica had described abuse in clinical terms, emotional distance, protecting her from breaking down. When Kelly had asked why she was subjecting herself to this testimony, when her own case couldn't be prosecuted, Jessica's answer had been directed at Emma sitting at the prosecution table. "So she knows she's not alone. So she knows adults believe her. So Kyle Morrison doesn't get to do this to victim number 4. Brennan's cross-examination had been brutal in its precision, attacking timing, questioning why she'd waited 8 years to report, suggesting she'd seen news coverage and fabricated matching story for attention or money. But Jessica had been prepared, her responses calm and consistent, her credibility holding under assault that would have destroyed less prepared witnesses. "Mr. Brennan, I gained nothing from being here except more pain. My case is past statute of limitations. I can't sue. I can't get compensation. I'm here because preventing future victims matters more than protecting myself from your questions." The jury had clearly been moved, several members taking notes during her testimony, their body language suggesting belief rather than skepticism. Day 3 had brought the bombshell that Kelly had been building toward. Melissa Torres had been sworn in at 0900 hours, 27 years old, social worker credentials establishing her as professional whose job required recognizing abuse. The gallery had buzzed when Deputy Torres had stood in the back row, his presence suggesting personal connection that became clear once Kelly had established Melissa's identity as his daughter. The testimony had been methodical establishment of facts. 15 years ago, Kyle Morrison dating Melissa's mother, 8 months of abuse while Torres had been deployed in Iraq. Melissa's silence born from shame and misplaced responsibility. The decision to keep a diary because she'd needed someone to believe her, even if only pages of a book. Kelly had entered the diary as evidence, defense objections overruled because Pennsylvania law permitted contemporaneous documentation in child abuse cases. The courtroom had been silent as Kelly had read selected entries aloud, 12-year-old handwriting, describing violations in child's vocabulary that somehow made them more devastating than clinical terms would have been. Brennan had objected repeatedly, arguing the diary was prejudicial, that its authenticity couldn't be verified, that it should be excluded. Judge Mendez had overruled each objection, her expression suggesting she'd read the diary during pre-trial review and understood its evidentiary value. Melissa's direct examination had concluded with Kelly asking why she'd never reported to her father, a cop with resources to investigate and prosecute. "I thought if a deputy's daughter couldn't be safe in her own home, what did that say about me? I thought I must have done something to make it happen. I didn't understand until therapy as an adult that predators target vulnerability, that Kyle chose me because my dad was deployed and my mom was overwhelmed. By then, legally, it was too late. The jury had been watching Deputy Torres during this testimony, seeing a father learning details he'd never known, watching him maintain composure through training and discipline, while his daughter recounted abuse that had occurred under his roof. The emotional impact had been visceral, several jurors openly crying. Brennan's cross-examination had been notably gentler than with Jessica, perhaps recognizing that attacking a cop's daughter would backfire with a jury already emotionally invested. He tried to suggest recovered memory that 15 years had distorted recollection. But Melissa had produced the diary contemporaneous evidence that couldn't be dismissed as false memory. This isn't recovered memory, Mr. Brennan. This is documented history. I wrote these entries when I was 12 years old. They've been in a safe deposit box for 15 years. They're not reconstruction. They're record. Brennan had ended cross-examination quickly, damage control rather than effective challenge. His strategy, crumbling against documentation, he couldn't explain away. Judge Mendez had called afternoon recess, giving everyone time to process emotional testimony before Emma took the stand. Hawk had found Emma in the witness preparation room, Sarah holding her daughter, while Kelly reviewed final reminders. The child's face had shown terror and determination in equal measure, understanding that everything came down to the next hour. Hawk had knelt beside her chair, bringing himself to eye level the way he'd done 3 months ago on a sidewalk outside Miller's Diner. You've heard Jessica and Melissa. You're not alone anymore. 3 of you telling the same truth. That's not coincidence, that's pattern. You go out there, you tell your story, and you change everything. What if I cry? Then you cry. Crying doesn't make you weak, makes you human. Emma had nodded, drawing courage from somewhere deep, from reserves that 9-year-olds shouldn't need, but some developed anyway. The walk to the witness stand had felt endless, small girl crossing courtroom space while Kyle Morrison sat at defense table 15 feet away, his expression carefully neutral under Brennan's coaching. Emma had kept her eyes forward, not looking at him, not giving him the satisfaction of her fear. Judge Mendez had spoken gently, explaining that Emma could take breaks, could ask for clarification, could say, I don't know, or I don't remember, without penalty, creating space for truth that wasn't perfect, but was honest. Kelly's direct examination had been masterful in its gentleness, starting with easy questions designed to let Emma find her voice before harder ones arrived. What grade are you in? What's your favorite subject? Do you like living in Millbrook? Building rapport, showing jury that Emma was normal child, not damaged goods or unreliable witness, but 9-year-old who'd been forced to carry adult-sized trauma. The transition to difficult testimony had been gradual, Kelly's voice never losing its gentle quality even as questions became harder. Emma, you live with your mom, right? Yes. And there was a time when Kyle Morrison lived there too. Yes, for a year. Did something happen during that time that scared you? Yes. Can you tell us what happened? Emma had looked at the jury, then at her mother, then at Hawk in the back row. He'd given the small nod they'd practiced, the signal that meant you're not alone, keep going. Kyle came to my room at night. When Mommy was at work, he touched me in places that felt wrong. The courtroom had been silent, except for Emma's voice, every person present understanding they were witnessing courage that most would never need to display. Kelly had walked Emma through details without forcing graphic descriptions, using age-appropriate language and the anatomical doll Emma had practiced with during preparation. The timeline had emerged, 6 months of abuse. Emma's attempts to tell Sarah dismissed as nightmares. The locked door, Kyle's key, the inability to escape. The morning Emma had decided she couldn't go to school anymore, couldn't pretend everything was normal for one more day. Emma, why did you tell Mr. Hawk instead of someone else? Because he looked at me like he believed me, like he wasn't going to say I was making it up. And did he believe you? Yes, he said he believed every word. Nobody ever said that before. Kelly had concluded direct examination, giving Emma a moment to breathe before Brennan's cross-examination began. The defense attorney had approached the stand with calculated friendliness, his voice gentle in the way that preceded attack. Emma, you have a good imagination, don't you? Sometimes. You like to make up stories. For fun, not about this. But you do sometimes tell stories that aren't true. Emma had looked confused, the distinction between creative play and testimony blurring under Brennan's questioning exactly as he'd intended. I make up stories about princesses and dragons, not about Kyle hurting me. How do we know which stories are real and which are imagination? Kelly had objected, argumentative sustained. But the seed had been planted, Brennan suggesting to the jury that Emma couldn't distinguish fantasy from reality. He'd continued in this vein, never directly calling Emma a liar, but implying confusion, suggesting her mother had influenced her testimony, pointing out that she'd spent time with the veterans who might have coached her. Each question designed to create doubt without appearing to bully a child. Emma had started crying halfway through, overwhelmed by questions that twisted her words and suggested she was wrong about her own experiences. Judge Mendez had called recess, giving Emma time to recover. In the witness room, Sarah had held her daughter, while Kelly had reminded her that tears were normal, that she was doing great, that just a few more questions remained. When they had returned to the courtroom, Emma had looked directly at Brennan with expression that combined fear and defiance. "Mr. Brennan, I'm not confused. I'm not making this up. Kyle Morrison hurt me. I know the difference between stories and what really happened. What happened was real." The spontaneous statement had broken through Brennan's careful strategy, Emma's voice carrying conviction that rehearsed answers never could. Several jurors had nodded slightly, their body language suggesting they'd seen enough. Brennan had ended cross-examination shortly after recognizing that continuing would only strengthen Emma's credibility. Kelly's redirect had been brief, just one question. "Emma, is everything you've told us today the truth?" "Yes, all of it." The direct simplicity had been more powerful than any elaboration. Emma had been excused, walking from the stand with the exhausted relief of someone who'd survived ordeal that should never have been required. The prosecution had rested. Brennan had moved for directed verdict, arguing insufficient evidence, motion denied. The defense had called two witnesses, a child psychologist who'd never met Emma, but testified about false memories, and Kyle's sister claiming her brother couldn't possibly be guilty. Both had been shredded on cross-examination, their testimony feeling hollow after three victims had described identical abuse patterns. Kyle Morrison had not testified, exercising his Fifth Amendment right against self-incrimination. The jury would be instructed not to consider his silence, but human nature made that impossible. Innocent men usually told their side. Silence suggested guilt. Closing arguments had come on day 5. Kelly and Brennan, each given 90 minutes to make final case. Kelly had stood before the jury with the bearing of someone who'd served in uniform and knew what defending the innocent truly meant. Three victims, 15 years, identical pattern. Kyle Morrison targets single mothers with young daughters. He infiltrates families. He waits until trust is established. Then he exploits that trust to abuse children who've been taught he's safe. Emma Morrison told you what happened. Jessica Rodriguez told you what happened to her. Melissa Torres told you what happened to her, and she wrote it down when she was 12 years old, proving this isn't recovered memory or fabrication. 12-year-old Melissa documented abuse in real time. That diary exists. You've seen it. You've read it. You can't explain that away as coaching or confusion or vindictive mothers. That's contemporaneous evidence of systematic predation. The defense wants you to believe 3 children across 15 years all confused appropriate affection with abuse. That's not reasonable doubt. That's impossible coincidence. But believe Emma, believe Jessica, believe Melissa, hold Kyle Morrison accountable. Brennan had countered with appeal to procedure over emotion. His closing argument focused on burden of proof and reasonable doubt rather than defending Kyle's character. The state must prove guilt beyond reasonable doubt, not beyond some doubt, beyond reasonable doubt. You've heard from a 9-year-old child with documented behavioral issues. You've heard from 2 women who waited years to report, timing their accusations after media coverage made their stories financially and socially valuable. You've heard from motorcycle club members who surrounded my client before police arrived, creating an environment of intimidation. Can you be certain beyond reasonable doubt? If you can't, you must acquit. That's not defending predators. That's defending the system that protects all of us from false accusations. The jury had deliberated for 8 hours across 2 days, deliberation extended by one holdout who'd eventually been persuaded by weight of evidence. When they'd filed back into the courtroom at 1847 hours on day 7, their faces had been grim with the burden of judgment they'd been required to deliver. The foreman had been the retired teacher, 71 years old, grandmother of 5, someone who'd spent career around children, and presumably knew what truth looked like. Judge Mendez had addressed her formally. Madam Foreperson, has the jury reached a verdict? We have your honor. What say you? The moment had stretched, time dilating the way it did when everything balanced on razor's edge. Emma had gripped Sarah's hand. Hawk had barely breathed. The entire courtroom had been suspended in anticipation of words that would define justice or failure. On count one, sexual abuse of a minor in the first degree, we find the defendant guilty. Sarah had collapsed forward, sobbing into her hands. Emma had looked confused for a moment, not understanding what guilty meant, until her mother had pulled her close and whispered that it meant people believed her, that Kyle was going to prison, that she was safe now. The foreman had continued through all counts, continuous sexual abuse, endangering welfare of child lewd acts with a minor guilty on every charge. Kyle Morrison's face had gone white, his expensive lawyer unable to prevent the verdict that three victims' courage had delivered. The gallery had erupted, Judge Mendez gaveling for order, bailiff moving to remove Kyle from the courtroom. In the back row, 20 veterans had stood at attention, military precision, honoring the courage of three young women who'd spoken truth despite every pressure to stay silent. The sentencing hearing had come 2 weeks later, procedural necessity that gave everyone time to process the verdict's implications. Kelly had prepared victim impact statements from all three women, each one choosing to read their own, rather than having Kelly deliver them. Emma's statement had been shortest, 9-year-old vocabulary expressing truths that didn't require complex language. Kyle made me scared in my own house. He made me think nobody would believe me. But Mr. Hawk believed me. And the jury believed me. I'm not scared anymore because Kyle is going to jail and can't hurt other kids. Jessica's statement had been longer, addressing not just her own abuse, but the years of silence that had followed. I thought I was alone for 12 years. I thought reporting would destroy my family and accomplish nothing. Seeing Emma's courage gave me courage. Testifying was the hardest thing I've ever done. But knowing Kyle Morrison will be held accountable makes it worth every minute of pain. Melissa's statement had been directed partly at her father, still processing his own guilt about not knowing what had happened under his roof. I don't blame my dad for not knowing. Predators are skilled at hiding. Kyle Morrison chose me because my father was deployed, because my mother was overwhelmed, because I was vulnerable. He calculated every move. But courage is contagious, Emma spoke first. That gave Jessica courage. That gave me courage. That's how we defeat predators, by speaking truth collectively until the pattern becomes impossible to deny. Judge Mendez had listened to all three statements before turning to Kyle Morrison, with expression that showed she'd judged thousands of defendants and knew which ones felt genuine remorse versus which ones only regretted getting caught. Mr. Morrison, you exploited your position as stepfather to perpetrate crimes against a vulnerable child. The evidence showed this wasn't an isolated incident, but established patterns spanning at least 15 years. 3 victims testified against you. 1 provided contemporaneous documentation written when she was 12 years old. You showed no remorse. You forced these young women to endure trial rather than accepting responsibility. I'm sentencing you to 20 years in state prison with no possibility of parole for 18 years. You will be registered as sex offender for life. Additionally, I'm recommending you serve your sentence in general population rather than protective custody. Sometimes natural consequences serve justice better than legal ones. The final comment had been unusual for a judge, but Mendez's meaning had been clear. In prison, child predators occupied the lowest tier, often targeted by other inmates who maintained their own code of justice. Kyle Morrison would spend 20 years looking over his shoulder, vulnerable in ways his victims had been vulnerable. The bailiff had led him from the courtroom in shackles, Kyle's family members crying in the gallery, his sister still insisting on his innocence, despite overwhelming evidence. Some people would never believe, because belief required accepting uncomfortable truths about people they'd thought they knew. Outside the courthouse, media had been waiting for statements. Kelly had handled it professionally, thanking the jury for their service, praising the 3 victims for their courage, acknowledging the veteran network that had provided support. She'd been careful not to gloat, recognizing that justice delivered wasn't the same as damage undone. Sarah had declined to speak to reporters, protecting Emma from further exposure, but she'd stood on the courthouse steps with her daughter and allowed photographs that would run in newspapers across the state. Mother and daughter who'd survived hell and come through the other side intact, if not undamaged. The celebration at the VFW Hall that evening had been subdued veterans understanding that victory in court didn't erase trauma or restore stolen childhoods. But there had been satisfaction in knowing they'd held the line, that Emma had received justice, that Jessica and Melissa had been denied, that Kyle Morrison would spend the next 2 decades paying for crimes he'd committed freely for too long. Colonel Morrison had raised a toast, his 81-year-old voice carrying the weight of authority earned through decades of service. To Emma, Jessica, and Melissa, 3 warriors who fought a battle most people will never understand and won against odds that defeat most victims. To the jury who had courage to believe children over comfortable denial. And to every veteran here who remembered that our oath to protect doesn't expire when we leave uniform. They drunk to that coffee and soda rather than alcohol because half the room was in recovery from various demons, the substance mattering less than the solidarity. 6 months after sentencing, life in Millbrook had found new rhythm. Not normal, nothing would ever be normal again, but functional. Emma attended online school through a program designed for children with medical or safety needs, her education continuing without exposure to bullies or the children of people who still believed Kyle was innocent. She saw Dr. Rebecca Stein twice a week for therapy, processing trauma in age-appropriate ways, learning that survival was possible even when scars remained. Sarah worked full-time at Tom Hendricks's hardware store, her hours flexible enough to be present when Emma needed her, her income stable enough to provide security they'd lacked before. She'd filed for divorce from Kyle Morrison, the proceedings uncontested, because he'd had no legal grounds to object from prison. The house they'd shared had been sold, proceeds divided according to prenuptial agreement Kyle's lawyer had once insisted on. Sarah and Emma lived in a small apartment now, but it was theirs, no predator hiding behind husband's mask. The veterans' protection rotation had scaled back, but not disappeared. Hawk still stopped by twice a week, ostensibly checking on Emma's homeschooling progress, but really just maintaining connection that had become something like family. Marcus had taught Emma basic motorcycle maintenance mechanical skills, giving her a sense of competence and control. Bear had trained her in basic first aid practical knowledge, deployed with his characteristic gentleness. Jax had started a journal project with her, documenting not just trauma, but recovery, creating narrative that showed she was more than what had been done to her. Jessica Rodriguez had returned to Philadelphia, but visited quarterly, her presence reminder to Emma that survival led to functional adulthood. She'd completed her social work degree, specializing in child advocacy, converting her own experience into professional capability to help others. She testified before the state legislature about statute of limitations reform, her advocacy contributing to new law that extended reporting windows for child abuse victims. Melissa Torres had launched a nonprofit called Pattern Recognition, dedicated to training teachers, coaches, and community members to identify signs of systematic child abuse. She'd become public speaker, her law enforcement father often appearing alongside her, both of them converting their personal failure into systemic change. The organization had reached 47 schools across Pennsylvania in its first 6 months, training thousands of adults in warning signs they'd previously missed or dismissed. Deputy Torres had been promoted to detective, assigned to the newly created Child Abuse Investigation Unit that the Morrison case had convinced county leadership was necessary. His first case had been successful prosecution of a youth pastor who'd been abusing altar boys for 3 years. Pattern Torres had recognized from his daughter's testimony, helping him identify identical grooming behaviors. Kelly O'Brien had taken on 3 more child abuse cases pro bono, her victory in the Morrison trial, establishing her reputation as attorney who could navigate the unique challenges of prosecuting abuse when victims were children and evidence was often limited to testimony. 2 of those cases had already resulted in convictions. The third was pending trial. Colonel Morrison had formalized the VFW's protection protocol, creating training program and policy manual that could be replicated by other posts. 17 VFW halls across 5 states had adopted the program, veterans finding new mission in protecting vulnerable children. The program had intervened in 22 suspected abuse situations in 6 months, 12 resulting in arrests, 3 in successful prosecution. Miller's Diner had started hosting monthly support group meetings for abuse survivors, Linda Martinez providing space and coffee, while Dr. Stein facilitated discussions. The meetings drew 8 to 15 people regularly, ages ranging from teenagers to elderly adults. all of them finding comfort in community that understood trauma without requiring explanation. Millbrook itself had changed in ways subtle and significant. The Justice for Kyle Morrison Facebook page had been shut down after he'd been convicted, though some members had continued insisting on his innocence. But the majority opinion had shifted the trial evidence too overwhelming to deny. 3 victims with corroborating stories, physical evidence expert testimony, and contemporaneous diary documentation had broken through the comfortable denial that initially protected the predator. The town had held a community meeting 2 months post-trial, addressing the systemic failures that had allowed Kyle to operate freely despite multiple warning signs. The school district had implemented new mandatory reporting procedures with consequences for administrators who failed to act on concerns. Tapes had received budget increase in additional training staff. The police department had created dedicated child abuse investigation unit. Hardware stores had started carrying door locks that children could install themselves. Practical safety measure Tom Hendricks had suggested and funded personally. None of it erased what had happened. Emma would carry scars from abuse and trial trauma for the rest of her life. Jessica and Melissa had lost childhoods that couldn't be recovered. Other victims who'd never spoken would continue suffering in silence, their courage not yet matching Emma's example. But something had shifted. Millbrook had been forced to confront uncomfortable truth that predators weren't monsters hiding in shadows, but people who looked like neighbors and coached Little League and married your waitress. That realization had made the town less comfortable but more vigilant, less naive but more protective. On an afternoon in late April, Hawk had taken Emma to the park, where Bear coached a kids' soccer team. She'd been cleared by Dr. Stein to try group activities again, her therapy progress suggesting she was ready for supervised peer interaction. Hawk had stayed on the sidelines, not hovering, but present, his role shifting from bodyguard to mentor. Emma had scored a goal in her first game clumsy kick that had somehow found the net more by luck than skill. She turned immediately to find Hawk in the crowd, her face lit with the kind of joy that had been absent for too long. He'd given her a thumbs up, the simple gesture, carrying weight that spectators wouldn't understand. This was what they'd been fighting for. Not just justice in courtroom, not just conviction and sentencing, but the possibility that a child who'd been victimized could eventually experience normal happiness, could score soccer goals and feel proud, could exist in the world without constant fear. After the game, Emma had approached Hawk with the particular seriousness 9-year-olds deployed when asking important questions. "Mr. Hawk, do you think your sister would be proud of you for helping me?" The question had landed like mortar fire, unexpected and devastating. Hawk had been quiet for a moment, looking at this child who'd somehow intuited that his motivation ran deeper than simple decency. "Yeah, kiddo, I think she would be. I'm glad you helped me. Even when it was scary, even when people said mean things, you stayed. That's what soldiers do. We don't quit when things get hard. We hold the line. Am I a soldier too?" Hawk had knelt down, bringing himself to her eye level one more time, this gesture that had started everything 3 months ago on a sidewalk outside a diner. "You're the bravest soldier I've ever met. You fought a battle most adults couldn't win, and you won. Don't ever forget that." Emma had hugged him, then impulsive child's gesture that had nearly broken his carefully maintained composure. He'd returned the embrace briefly before releasing her, aware that healthy boundaries mattered especially for abuse survivors who needed to relearn that physical affection could be safe. That evening, alone in his apartment above the shop, Hawk had finally allowed himself to believe that the war was over. Not the larger war predators would always exist. Victims would always need protection. The fight would continue until his last breath. But Emma's war had ended. She'd survived. She'd received justice. She'd found community that supported her recovery. He'd pulled out Kimberly's photograph one final time, looking at his sister's face, frozen at 16, 3 years before everything had fallen apart. "I saved this one, Kimmy. Couldn't save you, but I saved Emma. That has to count for something." The photograph had gone back in the drawer, not forgotten, but no longer needing to be on display. Some wounds healed even when scars remained. Some wars ended even when the soldier kept fighting. Hawk had set his alarm for 0500 hours, the habit that would never break, and had gone to sleep without dreaming of jungles or death, or the sister who'd needed him and found emptiness instead. Because tonight, somewhere in Millbrook, Emma Morrison slept safely in her own bed. No locked door required no fear of footsteps in the hallway, no secret too heavy to carry. She'd spoken truth and been believed. She'd faced her abuser in court and watched justice delivered. She'd survived trauma that destroyed many and emerged with possibility that life could still hold joy. That was victory. Not perfect, not complete, but real. The kind you measured not in medals or commendations, but in children who learned to smile again. The mission was accomplished. Emma was safe. And sometimes in a world that rarely delivered clean endings, that was enough.